Broadcasting from the dark corners of the earth, it's Tom Mordred's Midnight Radio. Excuse me, I'm just checking to make sure my levels are okay. I'm a good distance from the microphone this time. I worry that it picks up too much of my loud laptop fan. But excuse me for a moment while I adjust things. There we are. I should hope that's good enough. That actually it looks a little loud. I'm going to turn the gain down just a touch. How's that? There, levels look okay there. Just going into just a touch above there. Now, once again, we're going to have a bit of a preamble before we begin. I figured tonight, before we begin, instead of simply chatting idly, I'd regale you with a few facts. We, of course, have our familiar face of the Hell Priest, or Pinhead. The official name is the Hell Priest, but in the original Hellraiser film, released in 1987, he was simply referred to as Lead Cenobite. He didn't even have a name then. Pinhead was a name that the makeup crew gave him because previously he was meant to have pins in his head. However, after a screen test revealed that the pins would not show up on film, they changed it to nails so that they could be visible. Now keep in mind, this was in a time before Blu-rays and high-definition footage. It was just film. So a lot of things could be hidden a little better. But Pinhead is not the only one to have a cinematic debut. Our protagonist, Harry D'Amour, also appeared on screen. He appeared in 1995 in the film Lord of Illusions, and he was played by esteemed actor Scott Bakula, who is most known for his role as Captain Jonathan Archer on Star Trek Enterprise. Now, he might be known for something better, but I'm fairly certain that's how most people know him, is through Enterprise. I don't even think it was called Star Trek Enterprise in its first season. Regardless, when Pinhead first made his screen debut in 1987, he was played by British actor Doug Bradley. Since then, Pinhead has been played by 3 other actors. Hello. It's all good. Yes, come sit by the table. Or come sit. Tyler is meandering into the room. He's brought a blanket and his phone with him. I think he's going to fall asleep on the couch as I read. That's perfectly all right. In fact, that's exactly what this is for.
Until I go.
Yes, until you start snoring loudly. But perhaps that'll help other people sleep. If you're in the chat, please drop me a note. Since yesterday, however, I have created a little thing for us. Just a moment while I was about to say, but as I get it up, but that's probably not the right way to word that. Ta-da! We're just going to adjust this fellow.
I do love the idea of you being like, yes, hello, and then in the background it's like, yeah, read some books.
There he is, our old friend Harry D'Amour. And his arch rival for this particular story, the Hell Priest. I didn't do him exactly as he appears, but I think I got the general gist of him. Oops! Clicked on the wrong thing. It's okay. What else was I going to say? There have been to date 12 no, 11 Hellraiser films of varying quality. I did do a full retrospective on it, which you can see at our channel. In retrospect, I'm not overly proud of that video. It's very rough, and there are some choices that were made. But, we all have to take journeys. Clive Barker's first film was Hellraiser, and it is arguably his most famous film. We're going to wait just a bit longer. And then I'm going to do a short recap for what we've seen so far, and then we can dive right into it. I think my glasses might be quite dirty. I'll put my eye drops in. I have my Earl Grey tea with a slice of lemon. Ow! Hot! I didn't realize just how nice it is to have a slice of lemon in a cup of in a pot of Earl Grey tea. Ooh, listen to that pour. I don't know if that's picking up on mic. I doubt it, but it'll also cool me down, and drinking something hot will help keep me at a good temperature. Alright. So, when we last left our hero, Harry D'Amour, he had been investigating a house in New Orleans, where a ghost, who had contacted his friend Norma Payne, had told him he had a den of debauchery, which was hidden. He also claimed to not be a very skilled magician, but the paraphernalia found in a secret room in his house proved that to be not the case. While he was there, Harry was attacked by Pinhead, who I'm just going to call Pinhead because it's easy, even though I myself dislike it, because it's not a very nice name, nor is it even that accurate. They're nails. What else? Harry D'Amour had a fight with Theodore Felixson, in which he was gravely wounded. Theodore Felixson being one of 5 magicians who were slaughtered at the beginning of the book, or I guess one of 5 magicians who died at the front of the book, and beginning of the book, and who were all killed except for him, though he had some cruel and vicious surgery worked upon him. Now, let's have a quick peek at the time. I may as well start. Last we saw Harry, a strange man was approaching him, who laid his hands on him and spread a warmth through him, and then he fell unconscious. Let's begin. Or, let's continue. 9. There were no dreams at the beginning. He simply lay in the darkness, healing, and now and then he would rise to the surface of consciousness because somebody was talking about him near the place where he slept, or perhaps in the hallway outside. He had no desire to wake and become part of the conversation, but he heard the talk, or fragments of it at least. "This man belongs in a hospital, Dale," said the voice of an elderly man. "I don't believe in hospitals, soul," said the man who was Dale, his voice a playful Louisiana drawl. "Especially for someone like him. He wouldn't be protected there. At least here I know nothing can get him. For Pete's sake, there was a demon at the house on DuPont Street." "The same house he leveled?" the man called Saul replied. He didn't do that. But how can you be so sure? I don't like it, Dale, Saul said. Anyway, what the hell possessed you to go over to DuPont Street in the first place? You know about my dreams. They tell me where to go, and I go. I learned a long time ago not to ask questions. That's just trouble. I showed up. There he was. I only got him back here by giving him a little bit of my energies. He was close to collapsing the entire time. That was foolish. Skills like yours should be kept secret. It was necessary. How else am I going to get him out of there unseen? Look, I know it's crazy, but I know we need to help him get well. Fine, but once he's healed, I want him out. Dale, Harry thought. That was the name of his savior. The name of his savior was Dale. Harry didn't know who the other man in the conversation was, but he was sure he would meet him when the time was right. Meanwhile, there was that comfortable darkness to curl up in, which Harry did, certain in the knowledge he was safe. There were other conversations, or fragments of conversations that came and went. I'm just going to adjust my light just a bit. There were other conversations, or fragments of conversations that came and went, like night ships moving past him in the darkness. And then came the day when, without warning, everything in Harry's dreaming state changed. It started with Dale talking to him, his face so close to Harry he could tell him what he needed to in a whisper. Harry, dear, I know you can hear me. You're getting a visitor today. Solomon's just gone to pick her up. Her name's Freddie Belmer. She and Saul have been friends for a long time. Saul thinks Miss Belmer may be able to get your body to mend a little more quickly, though, between you and me, I sometimes wonder if you're not perfectly happy staying asleep in there. I know you've had some hard times. That spill you took being one of 'em. Oh, I'm sorry to report that your cell phone did not survive the fall. But I digress. As soon as Solomon got you cleaned up, and I don't mind telling you I was just a tiny bit jealous he didn't let me stay and watch, he called me in to see your tattoos. I don't know what all of them mean, but I know enough. They're protections, aren't they? Lord, you seem like a man that needs a lot of those. How shall I put this? He paused, as though looking for the right words, or if he already had the words, he was looking for the most diplomatic way of using them. Finally, he began to speak again, though it was plainly difficult. I always knew, even when I was small, you see. I knew I wasn't quite the same as the other boys. When my mother died, I never did know my father. I came to live with my Uncle Saul. I had just turned 6, and the moment old Uncle Saul laid eyes on me, he said, "Lord, look at the colors coming off of you. That's quite a show." That's when I knew I would have to live a different life than most folks. There'd be secrets I'd need to keep, which is fine. I'm good at keeping secrets. And I don't know what it is about you, but I just wanted you to know that whenever you do decide to wake up, I will gladly lap up anything you want to tell me about the world outside this stinky old town. And I look forward to the trouble we'll get into together. I don't know what it is yet. My dreams haven't shown me, but I know it's a doozy. Then the whispering was replaced by Solomon's deep voice. Are you kissing him? No, Dale replied calmly, without turning around. We were just talking. It wasn't Solomon who replied, but a new voice, that of Miss Belmer. Her voice was deep and severe. It wasn't as softly feminine as Harry had suspected, but then neither, as Harry would soon find out, was the owner of the voice. If you're done playing doctor, I would recommend that you step away from the bed, Miss Belmer said to Dale, and let me take a look at the patient. Her voice grew louder as she approached the bed. Then Harry heard the springs protesting as she sat down. She didn't touch Harry, but he felt the proximity of her hands as it moved over his face and then down his body. There was nothing said. Both Solomon and Dale were too much in awe of Miss Belmer to interrupt her during the examination of the patient. Finally, Miss Belmer spoke. I don't recommend keeping this man under your roof a moment more than you need to. The physical wounds are healing nicely, but I have somewhere," she said as she rummaged through her bag. "Something that will get him up on his feet a little quicker." The weighty Miss Belmer got up. "A teaspoon of this and half a cup of warm water." "What will it do?" Dale asked. "It will give him bad dreams. He's a little too comfortable there in the dark. It's time he woke. There's trouble coming." "Here?" said Solomon. "The entire world does not revolve around your house, Solomon. It's this one here, your Mr. Damour, that has some very bad things coming his way. Call me when he wakes up." "Is he in danger?" Dale asked. "Honey, that's an understatement." 10. Before leaving, the provocative Miss Freddy fed Harry his nightmare potion. The subtle energies her touch had released still pulsed through his body, long after his 3 caretakers had left him to sleep. It was a different kind of sleep now, however, as though Miss Belmer's tonic had subtly reordered his thoughts. Fragments of meaning flickered in the darkness. 2 or 3 frames cut from the movies of The Devil and Damour. No 2 demons were ever quite the same. They all had their own monstrous proclivities, and they rose to visit Harry from deep within his subconscious. There was, of course, the clay-faced creature who had murdered Scummy and pleasured himself to the sight. There is also a chattering imbecile called Gist, who had come very close to killing Harry in a plunging elevator a decade ago or more. There was Yesh Attar, the New Jersey incubus Harry had caught giving Holy Communion one Sunday morning in Philadelphia. Another was Zuzan, the unholy assassin who had taken the life of Harry's friend and mentor, Father Hess, in a house in Brooklyn. Others Harry couldn't even put a name to, perhaps because they didn't even have names. They were just dreams of mindless malice that crossed his path throughout the years, sometimes on an empty street, long after midnight, but just as often on the crowded avenues at noon when hell's creatures went about their vicious business in plain sight, defying human eyes to believe that they were real. After a while, however, the parade of atrocities dwindled, and Harry sank back into the darkness from which the arrival of Miss Belmer had stirred him. How long he stayed there, recovering his strength and healing, he had no idea, but certainly many hours. When he did finally rise from that healing darkness again, it was to the sound of rain. And it was no light shower. The rain was lashing against the window, and the din reminded him suddenly of how very much he needed to piss. He forced open his eyes, and saw that he was in a room lit only by the illumination from lamps outside in the street below. He threw off his sheet. He was completely naked, and he saw no sign of his clothes, which had been in a dusty, bloody state after all that had happened on DuPont Street. Noticing his nudity, he saw for the first time the wounds that had been dealt. He looked down at them. The flesh looked raw, but when he touched the place, he felt no more than a mild discomfort. These people who'd rescued him clearly knew their business as healers. He pulled the sheet off the bed, wrapped it loosely around his torso, and left his sick room in search of a place to relieve himself. There were 3 candles set in simple white bowls along the wall just outside his room. Harry saw that he was on the 2nd floor of a somewhat large French colonial-style home. "Hello?" he called. "I'm awake. And naked." Except for the sound of rain beating down on the roof, Harry's calls were met with silence. He moved on down the carpeted hallways, passing 2 more bedrooms, until he finally found a bathroom. Its tiled floor was chilly beneath his bare feet, but he didn't care. Unwrapping the bedsheet, he raised the toilet seat and unleashed the contents of his bladder with a blissful sigh. He went to the sink and ran the hot water. The pipes chugged and stuttered, the noise they made echoing off the tiled walls. He splashed some water on his face and examined his pallid complexion in the mirror. The noise in the pipes was getting louder. He realized he could now feel their lamentations through the floor. Then there was another sound, rising from the chug and shudder of pipes. It sounded as though someone was throwing up, here, in the bathroom with him. It wasn't hard to trace. The noise was coming out of the bath, or rather out of its plug hole, which, Harry now saw, was throwing up a gruel of dark grey water, bringing up with it a tangled mass of long black hair and what looked like recycled chunks of excrement. An unmistakable stench came to meet him in the darkness, that of human remains. It was a smell which Harry was woefully familiar, though it still carried power. The smell wasn't just repugnant, it was also a distracting reminder of rooms he'd stood in trenches and in... It was also a distracting reminder of rooms he'd stood in and trenches he'd uncovered where the dead lay in corruption, their skins barely containing the maggot motion they were home to. Kaz's handiwork twitched. No doubt about it. Harry had been awake for less than 5 minutes, and already he was in trouble. The filthy waters and their sickening freight had come to do him harm. How exactly they might do so was not a puzzle he had any desire to see solved. He snatched his makeshift clothing off the edge of the bath, wrapped it once more around his middle, and tucked it in on itself as he went to the door. He'd closed it when he came in, but given there was neither a key nor bolt to secure any further privacy, he was surprised to find that when he pulled on the knob, the thing refused to move. It was an unwelcome reminder of the doors on Dupont Street, some of which had been visible, some contentedly wrapped in hooks and chains, all conspiring against his next breath. He turned the polished knob in both directions, hoping to chance upon the trick of its release. But there was more than a faulty mechanism keeping the door from opening. He'd been sealed up in here with what, he didn't know. He glanced back at the bath. The hairs that had appeared from the plug hole had now risen up from the surface of the water in several places and were knitting themselves together, forming what was unmistakably the rough outline of a head. The cavorting waters rising up into it like fish caught in a net. Harry dragged his sight off this bizarrity so as to focus his attentions on getting the door open. He grabbed the knob with both his hands and proceeded to shake the door with deserved violence, coaxing it to open. "Open up, you son of a bitch!" But there was no movement, no sign, however minimal, that the door was succumbing to his assault. He gave up on the handle and tried another approach, pounding on the door with his fists and yelling for someone to save him. He shouted over and over, but there was no reply, only the sounds of the thing that was with him in the room. Twice he looked back at the bath as he pounded the door, and on each occasion the raw human form being sewn together with hair and water and shit was closer to completion. With the first glance, Harry saw only the head, shoulders, and rough sketch of its torso. On the second glance, the torso had been completed, all the way down to its sexless groin. The boneless arms were moving more like tentacles than human limbs. The hair hadn't even attempted to craft hands from its tangles. Instead, it slithered and coiled together until it had given itself 2 hammerhead-shaped fists, one of which slammed against the wall with astonishing force. The tiles it struck shattered, sending shards far enough to prick Harry's skin. The excremental stench had steadily grown in intensity as the creature rose up and out of its birthplace, the sting so sharp it brought tears to Harry's eyes. He wiped them away with the heel of his hand, and with his sight momentarily cleared, he looked around for something he could use to defend himself. All he had was the sheet he was wearing. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He untucked it, glancing up at the hammer-handed adversary. The creature was stepping out of the bath now, shedding globs of gummy, greasy fluid as it did so. The stink was overpowering. There were fresh tears welling in Harry's eyes again, but he hadn't time to clear his vision. The thing was out of the bath and swinging its left arm back over its right shoulder as it lurched towards Harry. As it did so, Harry opened the sheet and threw it high above the fetid waters of the enemy's head. The sheet landed on the creature and clung to it like leaves on a wet sidewalk. The creature was clearly disoriented. Whether Harry had actually blinded the beast for a moment, which seemed unlikely, or he'd simply confused it for a short time, the effect was the same. The thing swung its hammer hand high, intending to shear off Harry's head, but in the 4 or 5 seconds between the blinding and the blow, Harry had dropped down onto his haunches and out of the hammer's path. The beast's blow missed Harry by inches, but for the first time since waking into this vision, Harry felt the healing wounds from the Hell Priest's hooks break open with the sudden movement. His hand went down to the injuries in his thighs, and blood spilled down the sides of his legs and onto the linoleum beneath him. Harry dragged his bleeding ass across the floor in the hopes of putting some distance between himself and the hammers. Only when his spine hit the tiled wall and he could go no further did he dare look up at the foe. The sheet had proved more valuable than he'd expected. Soaking up the grey filth that churned between the woven hairs of its head and back, the sodden sheet clung relentlessly to the creature, much to its visible frustration. The creature reached up, trying to rid itself of the burden, but its hands were made for murder, not for tending shrouds, and in the frenzy it threw its whole body back and forth, causing some of the fluids to escape the fragile cage of its making. The creature stumbled, and, for a single heart-quickening second, Harry feared the creature was going to fall on top of him, but it reeled around and fell the opposite way, striking the door. The falling weight of water and filth in the ungainly body of the thing was enough to knock the door from its hinges so that it toppled out onto the carpeted landing. The fall tore a zigzag laceration up the side of the creature, and dark liquid matter poured forth from the wound, and was instantly absorbed by the carpet that sat beneath its protesting body. Harry watched in fascination as the creature bled out, leaving behind only a corpse of hair and feces that vaguely resembled a human form. As Harry struggled to pull himself to his feet, he heard Dale's voice. "Harry, are you all right?" It sounded as though Dale were in the room with him. Harry, still in shock, scanned the room with his eyes, and saw the wallpaper flicker like blown candle flames. Harry sighed. "Give me a break," he said. "There's no fucking way I'm dreaming." And then he woke up. "11. "I've called Miss Belmer," Solomon said as Dale and Harry sat down in the living room with their strongest drinks of choice to talk about what happened during the last few days. Solomon, a man no younger than 75, was lanky and tall, with a shock of grey hair. He stood nearly a foot taller than Dale, and was easily 30 years his senior. "Have you any enemies, Mr. Demore?" he asked. "I lost count before I graduated high school," Harry said. "Really now?" Dale said, a hint of arousal in his manner. "Well, that settles it," Solomon continued. "Something followed you down here, and decided to have you murdered while you were away from your usual protectors." "Protectors?" The folks in your life who know who you really are," Dale offered. "I guess that would be Kaz and Norma." "That's it," said Solomon. "You don't trust a lot of people, do you?" Most people I used to trust aren't around anymore." "Oh, honey," Dale said. "I'll be your friend." "I'm sorry," Solomon said. "It's fine," Harry said. "Some die too soon. Most live too long." Before anyone had time to reply, someone rapped sharply on the front door. "That'll be Miss Belmer," Solomon said. "You two stay here." Solomon went to the front door, and Harry's unscratchable itch started its familiar song. Harry squirmed in his seat. "What on earth is wrong, Sol?" Harry heard Miss Belmer saying out in the hallway. "You look troubled." "Oh, no more than usual," Solomon replied. "Well, thank the Lord for small mercies. How's the patient?" "He's doing fine." Upon which words Solomon brought Miss Belmer into the room. Freddie Belmer looked more than a little surprised to see Harry. Aside from her reaction, Harry noted that Miss Belmer had a beautiful face, high cheekbones, huge dark eyes, and lips so perfect they looked carved. But he also saw that there was something about her height. She was easily as tall as Solomon, and her clothes, though brightly colored and voluminous, they carefully concealed the shape of her body, that created a distinctive ambiguity about her. "Your tonic seems to have done its job," Solomon said. "So it has," Miss Belmer said. "Detective Demore, meet Miss Freddie Belmer," Solomon said. "She's been a friend of mine since, well, Since before I was Miss Belmer, she said, as I'm sure your patient has already deduced. Isn't that right, Detective? Harry shrugged as he rose to shake Belmer's hand. I'm off duty. Dale snickered. Belmer smiled an abundant smile, which somehow felt like a denunciation to Harry. She took Harry's hand in hers. Her calloused hands belied her dainty handshake. You're a lot livelier than the last time I saw you, she said. I have a strong constitution. Without a doubt. But I do have a warning for you, Mr. Demore. I didn't just look at your physical wounds. I looked at the important things, too. The will, the soul. Lord, but you must have had some hard times. You're nothing but one big psychic scar. I never saw such a mess in all my life. Takes one to spot one. Dale tried hard to cover up a smile, but clearly he was enjoying the show. Grow up, Dale, said Miss Belmer. You stupid queen. At least this queen can still tell you to suck his dick, Dale said. Now it was Harry who tried covering a smile. Children, play nice, Solomon said. Miss Belmer sighed, her hand going to her brow. Saul, darling, do you by any chance have some vodka in the house? Coming right up, Saul said, and he went in search of vodka, leaving Miss Belmer to pick up her conversation with Harry. So, how do you feel? Miss Belmer said. Alive, Harry said, and then he leaned in close to Miss Belmer and whispered, No thanks to you. Admit it. You were surprised to see me when you walked in. I remember your voice. I remember what happened when you visited me, and something tells me that if that disgusting beast in my dream had caught me, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. So what I'd like to know is, to whom did you sell your soul, and for how much? Miss Belmer smiled, cleared her throat, and said, I'm sure I have no idea what you're talking about, Detective. Very convincing, Demore said as he turned away from Belmer and made his way carefully back to the couch. Freddie, you may want to reapply your blush, dear. You've gone white as a sheet, Dale said. Fuck off, Dale, Belmer said, her voice deepening. As for you, Demore, I'd tread lightly if I were you. I've got powerful friends in high places, very fucking high. I'm protected. Take it from me, Harry said. They really don't care about little people like us. We're cannon fodder to them. You don't know who they are. Whatever you say, sir. I promise you, come the day, you'll be out in the rain same as me. Harry's response had sown sufficient doubt in Miss Belmer's head to silence her. Belmer's lips were pinched tight as though she was doing her best not to give Demore any more rope with which she could be hanged. I've never seen you so quiet, Freddie, Dale said, happy to fan the flames. What's the matter, doll? Cat got your cock? Belmer wagged a long, well-manicured finger at the two men. I've got something special lined up for a whole bunch of people, and you're both on the list now. Mutts like you go straight in the ground. I'll make you dig the hole yourself, then I'll kick you in and cover you up. Neat, cheap, anonymous. Christ almighty, said Dale. Where did that come from? You already tried to kill me once, said Demore. If you try it again, I might not like it. We'll see how much you like it when you're eating dirt, motherfucker. Take my advice. Go the fuck home. Freddie, Solomon said. What's come over you? Solomon had emerged from the kitchen with an unopened bottle of vodka and 4 shot glasses, and had caught at the tail end of her speech. Freddie turned and saw the disappointment in her old friend's face. Saul, Belmer said, attempting to compose herself, I came to warn you. This man's dangerous. I think you should leave, Saul said. Freddie Belmer took a moment to digest Solomon's words. When it was clear he was not going to rescind them, she whipped her long, straight hair over her shoulder and consulted her watch, which looked minuscule on her broad, thick wrist. Look at that, she said, trying to maintain a modicum of composure. I'm late for my next patient. And without saying goodbye, she was out through the door. There was a moment of silence, and then Dale spoke. I always knew she was a cunt. "12. Harry took the noon flight out of New Orleans the next day. He had tried to offer Solomon and Dale some money for their many kindnesses, but of course they wouldn't take a cent, and Harry knew that to press them would only cause discomfort, so he made his thanks and gave them his card before heading back to a rainy, gray New York. When he got home, he was pleased to find everything just the way he liked it. His apartment was chaotic, and his kitchen was littered with beer cans and boxes of Chinese food that had turned into little ecosystems of mold. He left it all for another day. What he wanted most was some more sleep. This time he hoped without the potentially fatal dreams. He took off his jacket and shoes as he staggered into the bed and dropped down onto it. He was barely in the process of pulling up the cover when sleep overwhelmed him and he sank into its depths unresisting. After sleeping almost 26 hours, Harry slowly allowed his aching body to familiarize itself with the state of wakefulness, and after a healthy interlude of inner debating, he got up out of bed and made his bleary-eyed way to the bathroom. As the water poured over him, Harry imagined it cleaned him not only of his body's naturally collected oils, but also of the events of the past few days. And as the water did its best to sluice away Harry's memories, his thoughts went into his wounds. He looked down and saw that his thighs looked almost totally healed, though he knew he was going to have a couple of shiny new scars to show for it. All in a day's work, he thought. A half-hour later, showered, dressed in clean clothes, and carrying a comfortably concealed, fully loaded revolver, he was out on the street, heading towards Norma's place. He had much to tell her. The rainstorm had moved on, and the city sparkled in the late summer sun. His mood was good, even optimistic, which was rare. Good may have lied about more than a few things, but at least the money in his lockbox was real, and, because of it, Harry could finally pay back the rent he owed. 3 months, at least, perhaps 4, and maybe even buy a pair of shoes that didn't leak. But after that, he'd be back to square one. The problem with being a PI whose career was periodically hijacked by forces beyond his control wasn't that unnatural forces left him covered in dust and blood. It was the fact that they typically didn't pay well. That said, there was an undeniable pleasure to be had from knowing something about his beloved city's secret life that other people didn't. Mysteries that the expensive beauties who gave him chilly looks if they caught his admiring gaze, or the high-octane executives with their $1,000 haircuts would live and die never knowing. New York wasn't the only city in the world that had magic in its blood. All the great cities of Europe and of the Far East kept their own secrets as well, many more ancient than anything New York could boast. But there was nowhere in the world that had such a concentration of supernatural activity as Manhattan. For those like Harry, who'd trained themselves to look past the glorious distractions the city offered, evidence could be seen just about anywhere that the island was a battlefield, where the better angels of human nature perpetually warred with the forces of discord and despair, and nobody was immune. Had Harry been born under a star less kind, he might well have ended up amongst the city's nomadic visionaries, his days taken up with begging for enough money to buy some liquid oblivion, his nights spent trying to find a place where he could not hear the adversaries singing as they went about their labors of the dark. They had only ever sung one song within shot of Harry, and that was Danny Boy, that hymn to death and maudlin sentiment that Harry had heard so often that he knew the words by heart. On his way to Norma's, he stopped at Rupert's Deli and bought the same breakfast he'd bought there whenever he was in the city every day. I'm gonna take that again. On his way to Norma's, he stopped at Rupert's Deli and bought the same breakfast he'd bought there whenever he was in the city, every day for the better part of 25 years. Jim Rupert had always had Harry's coffee poured, sugared, and hit with just a dash of cream by the time he'd get to the counter. "Harry, my friend," Jim said, "we ain't seen you in a week, at least, my wife says. He's dead. Hang on, let me try that again. "Harry, my friend," Jim says, "we ain't seen you in a week, at least. My wife says he's dead, and I say not Harry, no way. Harry doesn't die. He goes on forever. Isn't that right?" "Sure feels that way sometimes, Jim." Harry left some money in the tip jar, more than he could afford, as usual, and headed out the door. As he exited the shop, he collided with a man who seemed to be in a hurry, even if he didn't appear to know where he was headed. The man grunted, "Not here," and surreptitiously slipped a scrap of paper into the palm of Harry's hand. Then the man wove around Harry and continued down the street. Harry took the stranger's advice and walked on, curiosity speeding up his step. He turned a corner into a quieter street, not planning a particular route, just wondering where he was being watched from, and who by, that the messenger should warn him the way he had. Harry checked the reflections in the windows on the opposite side of the street to see if anyone had followed him, but he saw no one. He kept walking, the paper crumpled up in his left fist. About 2/3 of the way down the block, he was at a florist store called Eden & Co. He went in, taking the opportunity to glance back down the street. If he was being followed, it was not his ink and his instinct told him, by any of the half-dozen people who were walking in his direction. The air in the flower store was cool, moist, and heavy, with the mingled perfumes of a dozen blossoms. A middle-aged man with an immaculately trimmed mustache that followed the line of his mouth like a third lip appeared from the back of the store and asked Harry if he was looking for anything in particular. "Just browsing," Harry said. "I love flowers." "Well, let me know if you decide on anything." "You bet." The man with the perfect mustache stepped through the beaded curtain at the back of the shop and immediately started up a conversation in Portuguese, which Harry's arrival had apparently disrupted. No sooner had the man begun than a woman came back at him, speaking twice as fast and in an obvious rage. While their heated conversation went on, Harry wandered around the store, looking up now and again to see if there was anyone watching from the street. Finally, having convinced himself that he was not being spied upon, he opened his fist and smoothed out the piece of paper. Before he read a single word, he knew it was from Norma. "Don't come to my apartment. It's bad. I'm in the old place. Come at 3 a.m. If you itch, walk away." "A message?" the woman asked. Harry looked up. He barely had time to bite back the "Christ!" he almost muttered at the sight of her. 3/4 of the woman's face were a rigid mass of smeared and indented scar tissue. The remaining quarter, her beautiful left eye and brow above it, plus the elaborately coiffed wig, which was a mass of curls, only seemed to make the erasure of the rest of her face seem even crueler. Her nose was reduced to 2 round holes. Her right eye and mouth were shorn of lashes and lips. Harry fixed his attention on her left eye and stumbled over his reply, which was simply a repeating of her question. "Message?" he said. "Yes," she said, glancing down from the scrap of paper in his hand. "You want this with the flowers?" "Oh," Harry said, breathing a sigh of relief. "No, thank you." He quickly pocketed the message, nodded, then left the flower shop and its bad omens behind him. Harry took the note and his puzzlement over its contents, along with a fierce hunger to Charrington's pub, a dark, quiet watering hole that he'd found the first day he'd come to New York. It served old-fashioned food with a minimum of fuss, and they knew him so well that he only had to slide into his corner and give a little nod to the waitress named Phyllis, and there'd be a large bourbon, no ice, on his table within 60 seconds, sometimes less. Having a routine that bordered on stagnancy had its benefits. "You're looking good, Phyllis," Harry said, as she brought him his drink in record time. "I'm retiring." "What? What? When?" "End of next week. I'm gonna have a little party on Friday evening, just for the staff and a few regulars. You in town?" "If I am, I'll be here." Harry studied her. She was probably in her mid-60s, which meant she'd been edging towards 40 when Harry first found the place. 40-something to 60-something was a lot of life. A lot of chances come, gone, and never coming round again. "You gonna be okay?" Harry asked. Yeah, I'm not planning on dying or nothing. I just can't take this place anymore. I don't sleep nights. I'm tired, Harry." "You don't look it." "Aren't you guys supposed to be good liars?" she said, as she headed away from the table, saving Harry from fumbling for a reply. Harry settled back into the corner booth and pulled out the note again. It wasn't like Norma to be scared. She lived in what was unequivocally the most haunted apartment in the city. She'd held advice sessions for the dead for more than 3 decades, hearing stories of violent deaths by those who'd experienced them firsthand. Murder victims, suicides, people killed crossing the street or stopped in their tracks by something dropped from a window. If anyone could have honestly claimed to have heard it all before, it was Norma. So what was it that made her leave her ghosts and her televisions and her kitchen where she knew the location of everything down to the last teaspoon? He looked at the clock above the bar. It was 6:32. He had 8 hours to go. He couldn't wait that long. "Fuck this 3 in the morning crap," Harry said. He downed his bourbon and called over to Phyllis. "Time to close the tab, Phyllis." "Where's the fire?" she said, sauntering back to Harry's booth. I gotta get to someplace faster than I thought." He tucked $100 bill in her hand. "What's this for?" "You," Harry said, already turning towards the door, "in case I don't make it to your party." 13. Harry stepped out of the cab on the corner of 13th and 9th. The intersection was not Harry's true destination. A few blocks farther down in what had been a well-kept building that had once housed lawyers and doctors, including psychiatrists. It was the waiting room of one of the latter, a psychiatrist by the name of Ben Krackomberger, M.D., that Harry had first met Norma Payne. After the events of Scummy's death, Harry had been taken off active duty. Harry's version of events that led to the night that his partner lost his life proved to be a bigger bite than the department could chew, so they sent him to Krackomberger, who, in a courteous but insistent fashion, kept pressing Harry on the details of what he'd imagined he'd seen. Harry would go through it all, again and again, moment by moment, foiling Krackomberger's attempt to catch Harry out with some inconsistency from telling to telling. Finally, the doctor said, "It comes down to this, Harry. In the end, your version of what happened that day is preposterous. In less serious circumstances, I'd call it laughable." "Is that a fact?" "Yes. So I've been pouring my fucking heart out to you." "Calm down, Mr. D'Amour." Harry rose to his feet. "Don't interrupt me. You've been telling me all this time. You've made me go over and over it, and you were laughing inside?" "I didn't say—" "Please, Mr. D'Amour, sit down or I'll be obliged to have you forcibly—" "I'm sitting, okay? Is that okay?" Harry said, taking a seat on the table that rested between the good doctor and his therapy couch. "Yes, but if you feel the need to get up again, then I suggest you leave. And if I do, what will you put on my papers?" "That you are unfit for service due to extreme delusional states, almost certainly brought on by the trauma of the incident." "Nobody is calling you crazy, Mr. D'Amour. I just need to give your superiors an honest assessment of your condition." "Extreme delusional states," Harry said softly. "People respond to the kind of pressure you've had to endure in very different ways. You seem to have created a kind of personal mythology to contain the whole terrible experience, to make sense of it." He was interrupted by a series of crashes from the next room, where Krackomberger's secretary sat. "It's not me," a woman's voice, not that of the secretary, said. The doctor got up, making a mumbled apology to Harry as he opened the door. As Krackomberger did so, several magazines sailed past him and landed on the Persian carpet in the doctor's office. Suddenly the hairs on the back of Harry's neck stood on end. Whatever was wrong in the next door, it wasn't just an irate patient, Harry's UI told him. This was something altogether stranger. He took a deep breath and followed Krackomberger through the waiting room. As Harry did so, the doctor retreated, stumbling over his own feet in his haste. "What the hell's going on in here?" Harry said. Krackomberger looked at him, his face drained of blood, his expression crazed. Did you do this?" he said to Harry. "Is this some kind of practical joke?" "No," said the woman in the waiting room. Harry followed the woman's voice and saw her. She had the high cheekbones and the lavish mouth of a woman who'd once been a classic beauty, but life had marked her deeply, etching her black skin with frown marks and grooves around her downturned mouth. Her eyes were milky white. It was obvious that she couldn't see Harry, but regardless, he felt her gaze upon him, like the softest of winds blowing against his face. All the while, something in the room was having a fine time of it, overturning chairs, sweeping half the contents of the secretary's desk onto the floor. "It isn't his fault," the woman said to Krackomberger. "And it isn't mine, either." She clutched her walking stick and took a step in their direction. "My name's Norma Payne," the blind woman said. Crackenburger stood frozen in a daze. Harry took it upon himself to speak for the doctor. "He's Ben Crackenburger. I'm Harry. Harry D'Amour." "Not the same D'Amour who was involved in that mess with the dead cop?" "The very same." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. D'Amour. Let me offer you a bit of advice," she said, as she said to Harry as she pointed a finger at Crackenburger. "Whatever this man tries to tell you, what you did or didn't see, just agree with him." "What? Why would I do that?" "Because people like him have a vested interest in silencing people like us. We rock the boat, you see." "Is that what you're doing right now?" Harry said as he nodded to the framed pictures that were coming off the walls one by one. Not simply falling, but being lifted off their hooks as if by invisible hands, then thrown down so violently the glass shattered. "As I said before, I'm not the one doing this," Norma said. "One of my clients is here with me." "Clients?" "I talk to the dead, Mr. D'Amour, and this particular client doesn't feel as though I'm paying enough attention. Dr. Crackenburger, say hello to your brother." Crackenburger's chin quivered. "Impossible," he muttered. "Warren, yes?" Norma said. "No, Warren is dead." "Well, of course he's dead," Norma snapped. "That's why I'm here." The doctor looked utterly bewildered by this piece of logic. "She says she talks to the dead is what she's saying, Doc," Harry put in. "I'm not speaking Swahili," Norman said to Harry. "I don't need an interpreter." "I don't know," Harry said, looking at Crackenburger. "He looks pretty confused." "Try and pay attention, Doctor," Norma offered. "Your brother told me to call you Shelley, because that's your middle name, and not many people know that. Is it true?" "You could have found that out any number of ways." "All right, forget it," Norma said, turning her back on the doctor. "I need a brandy. Mr. D'Amour, would you like to join me in a little toast to the idiocy of psychiatrists?" "I would happily drink to that, Miss Payne." "Warren," Norma said, "let's go. We're frightening innocent people." She was speaking, Harry supposed, of the receptionist who had taken refuge under the desk when the pictures had started to drop, and hadn't emerged since. "Wait," said Crackenburger said as they headed for the door. "You're blind, aren't you?" "And you're perceptive," Norma said. "Then how can you possibly see my brother?" "I don't have any idea. I only know I can. The world is invisible to me, but perfectly clear to you. The dead are invisible to you, but perfectly clear to me. You're telling me you can see my brother, right now?" Norma turned her back and stared into the office. "Yes, he's lying on your couch. What's he doing?" "You really want to know? I asked, didn't I? He's masturbating. Jesus, it's him." From that chance encounter, the friendship of Harry and Norma sprang. And like much that happens by chance, this collision of souls could not have been more essential for both. Harry had been doubting his sanity in those recent weeks, the fuel for that fire supplied by Dr. Crackenburger, and suddenly there was Norma, talking to the supernatural as if it was the most natural thing in the world, something that was happening across the city every moment of every day. It was she who had first said, when Harry unburdened himself of what he'd seen the day of his partner's death, that she believed every word of it, and that she knew men and women around the city who could tell stories of their own that were evidence of the same otherness present in the daily life of the city. As Harry drew within sight of the old building, he was surprised to find just how much it had changed over the years. The windows were either boarded up or broken, and there'd apparently been a fire at some point in the building's history, which had gutted at least a third of the place. Scorch marks blackening the facade and the burned-out windows. It was a sad sight, but more significantly, it was a troubling one. Why would Norma leave the comfort of her apartment for this god-forsaken corner of nowhere? All the doors were severely locked and bolted, but it wasn't a problem for Harry, whose solutions to such setbacks was the always old-fashioned brute strength. He chose one of the boarded-up doors and pulled off several of the wood planks. It was a noisy, messy business, and if there'd been any kind of security patrolmen guarding the building, as several prominently placed signs announced there were, they would have certainly come running. But as he expected, the signs were bullshit, and he was left to his own devices without interruption. Within 5 minutes of his labor, he had oh goodness, he had denuded the door of its boards and picked the lock that lay behind them. Nice work, kid, he said to himself as he stepped inside. Harry took out a mini flashlight and shone it in the room. He saw everything that had distinguished the modestly elegant lobby in which Harry now stood. The deco sweep of the design of the mirrors, the etchings in the tile underfoot, and the shape of the lighting fixtures which had been destroyed. Whether the destruction was the result of a crude attempt to take up the tiles for resale and bring down the mirror and light fixtures intact for the same purpose, or if the place had simply been smashed up by drugged-up vandals with nothing better to do, the result was the same: chaos and debris in place of order and purpose. He walked through the litter of glass and tile shards until he reached the stairs. Then he began to ascend. Apparently there were easier ways into the building than prying open one of the doors, as he had, because the sharp smell of human urine and the duller stink of feces grew strong as he climbed. People used this place as a toilet, yes, but probably also to sleep in as well. He eased his hand around the revolver, tucked snugly in its holster, just in case he found himself discussing real estate law with any bad-tempered tenants. The good news was how very inactive his tattoos were. Not an itch, not a spasm. Apparently Norma had made a smart choice for a bolt hole. Not the most salubrious of the surroundings, but if it kept her safely hidden from the adversaries and its agents, then Harry had no qualms. Dr. Krakenberger's office had been Suite 212. The plush beige carpeting that had covered the passageway leading up to it had been rolled up and removed, leaving just the bare boards. With every second or third step Harry took, one of them creaked, and Harry grimaced. Finally, Harry reached the door with his one-time psychiatrist's office and tried the handle, expecting it to be locked. The door was opened without protest, and Harry was faced with another yet of spectacle of vandalism. It looked as though someone had taken a sledgehammer to the walls inside. He chanced a word. Norma? Then several words. Norma, it's Harry. I got your message. I know I'm early. Are you here? He went through into Krakenberger's office. The books that had lined the doctor's walls had not been taken, though it was obvious that at one point they'd all been stripped from the shelves and a pile of them used to make a fire in the middle of the room. Harry squatted beside the makeshift fire pit and tested the ashes. They were cold. Finding nothing more, Harry took a peek inside Krakenberger's private bathroom, but it was as trashed as the rest of the place. Norma was not here. But she had led Harry to this place for a reason. Of that he was certain. He chanced to glance at the bathroom mirror, and there he saw, scrawled in the surface of the grimy glass, an arrow drawn in ash. It was pointing downwards, toward the lower floors. Norma had left him a breadcrumb. Harry left the office where he'd met his sightless friend so many years ago and headed to the basement. "14. Excuse me. Actually, I'm going to take a little drink. Anyone in the chat today? Tonight? You don't have to talk. But it would be nice to know I'm not broadcasting to no one. Anyways. 14. The members-only club that had once occupied the basement of the long-forgotten building had been designed for the elite New Yorkers with more outre tastes than could be satisfied at the sex emporiums that had once run along the 8th Avenue and 42nd Street. Harry had glimpsed it in operation many years before when he'd been hired by the building's owner, one Joel Hinz, to do some detective work regarding his wife. Despite the fact that Hinz ran an establishment dedicated to hedonism of every stripe directly under the feet of the city's lawmakers, he was a deeply conservative man in his personal life, and was genuinely distressed when he began to suspect his wife of being unfaithful. Harry had done his investigations about 3 weeks later, and had brought confirmation in the form of incriminating photograph of Mrs. Hinz, to the grieving Mr. Hinz, in a large manila envelope. As Hinz requested, he'd sent his assistant, J.J. Fingerman, to take Harry down into the club and get him a drink and a quick tour of the premises. It was quite an eye-opener. Bondage, whipping, caning, water sports. The club offered a smorgasbord of perversities practiced by men and women, most of them dressed in costumes that announced their particular proclivities. A 50-year-old man, whom Harry recognized as the mayor's right hand, was tottering around on stiletto heels in a frilly French maid's outfit. A woman who organized celebrity fundraisers for the homeless and the destitute was crawling around naked with a dildo impaled in her ass, from the base of which hung a tail of black horsehair. On the main stage was one of the most successful writers of Broadway musicals. He was tied to a chair, having the flesh of his scrotum spread out and nailed to a piece of wood by a young woman dressed as a nun. To judge by the state of the lyricist's arousal, the procedure was pure bliss. When Harry's tour had ended, he and Fingerman returned to Hinz's office and found the door was locked from the inside. Rather than wait for the keys to be located, Harry and Fingerman kicked open the door. The cuckolded husband lay sprawled over his desk, where the photographs Harry had taken of Miss Hinz in her various liaisons were spread. The photographs had been spattered with blood, bone fragments, and brain matter that had emptied in all directions when Hinz had put a gun into his mouth and pulled the trigger. The party was over. Harry had learned a lot that night about the close relation of pain and pleasure. In certain situations, along with what fantasy and desire could drive people to do. Harry found a cluster of light switches at the top of the stairs and flicked them on. Only 2 of them worked, one turning on a light directly over Harry's head, which spilled down the black-painted stairs, the other turning on a light in the booth where guests had paid their entrance fee and received a key for a little changing room where they could shed their public skins and don the masks of who they really were. Harry cautiously headed down the stairs. There were a few small twitches and a flutter of activity in one of his tattoos. The rendering of a ritual necklace that Kaz had dubbed the Scrimshaw ring. While many of Kaz's tattoos were simple talisman and made no pretense to solidity, the Scrimshaw ring had been so meticulously rendered in the trompe l'oeil style, the shadow beneath it so dense that it made the necklace appear to stand proud on Harry's skin. Its function was relatively simple. It alerted Harry to the presence of ghosts. But given that the spirits of the dead were everywhere, in some states of panic or agitation, others simply taking the air after suffocations of death, the Scrimshaw ring discriminated nicely and did not alert Harry's presence to any revenants except those that posed the greatest possible threat. And apparently, there was one such ghost, at least one, in Harry's immediate vicinity, now. Harry paused at the bottom of the stairs, contemplating the very real possibility that this was another trap. Perhaps it was a ghost hired by the powers he'd confronted and embarrassed in New Orleans. But if they wanted revenge, why come all this way to send only a few phantoms? They could frighten the unwitting, to be sure, but Harry was scarcely that. A little spook show wasn't going to leave him trembling. Harry pressed on. The club seemed to have been left in the very state it had been when Hinz put a bullet through his brain. The bar was still intact, the bottles of hard liquor still lined up, waiting for thirsty customers. Harry heard the glasses stacked underneath the bar start to chime as one of the ghosts began its performance. When he ignored the noise and continued his advance, the spirit threw several of the shot glasses into the air. They were pitched down onto the bar with such violence that a few of the shards struck Harry. He didn't respond to this display. He simply made his way past the bar into the big room with the St. Andrew's cross set next to the stage, where whip-wielders once showed off their expertise. Harry ran his light around the room, looking for some sign of the presence here. He stepped up onto the dais, intending to continue his search for Norma backstage. But as he crept closer to the velvet curtain, he heard a noise off to his right. His gaze shot in the direction of the sound. The opposing wall there had an array of canes, paddles, and whips hung on it, maybe 50 instruments in all. A few of the lighter items dropped to the floor, and then one of the heavy wooden paddles was pitched in Harry's direction. It hit his knee hard. "Ah, fuck this," he said, jumping off the stage and walking straight into the assault. "My tattoos were telling me you're a threat, but I am not remotely intimidated by whoever you are. So if you're gonna go on throwing shit at me, I will spit out a sigilistic that will make you wish you never died. I promise you." Harry had no sooner voiced this threat than one of the biggest whips on display was pulled down off the wall and drawn back in preparation for a strike. "Don't do it," Harry said. His warning went disregarded. The phantom wielding the whip was either very lucky or it knew its business. With its first strike, it caught Harry's cheek, a sharp sting that made his eye water. "You dickhead," he said. "Don't say I didn't warn you." He started to speak the sigilistic, which was one of the first he'd ever learned. "I vutu quathakiai nomnot nomnetha e vutu quakathai antibethis." He was barely a third of the way through the utterance, but the incantation was already revealing the presences in the room. They looked like shadows thrown up on steam, their edges evaporating, their features scrawled on the air like an artist was working on the rain. There were 3 of them, all men. "Stop the sigilistic," one of them moaned. "Give me one reason why I should." "We were only following orders." "Whose orders?" The phantoms exchanged panicky looks. "Mine," said a familiar leathery voice from the darkness of the room. Harry let his guard down immediately. "Norma! What the hell?" "Don't torment them, Harry. They were only trying to protect me." "All right," Harry said to the phantasms. "I guess you guys get a reprieve." "Stay at your posts, though," Norma said. "He could have been followed." "Not a chance," Harry said, all confidence as he walked into the back rooms. "Famous last words," said Norma. Harry tried the light switch, and the wall-mounted lights went on, the bulbs so red as to flatter the nakedness of the old customers' gristly hides. Norma was standing in the middle of the room, leaning on a stick, her hair grey, going white, unpinned for the first time in all those years Harry had known her. Her face, though still possessed of the elegant beauty and power of her bones, was slack with exhaustion. Only her eyes had motion in them, the colourless pupils appearing to watch a tennis match between 2 absolutely equal players. Left to right, right to left to right to left, the ball never once fumbling. "What in God's name are you doing down here, Norma?" "Let's sit. Give me your arm. My legs are aching." "You're not being helped by the damp down here. You should be more careful at your age." "We're neither young of us as we used to be," Norma said as she led Harry through what had once been the room where the players only went when they were in the mood for extreme games. I can't do this much longer, Harry. I'm damn tired." "You wouldn't be damn tired if you were sleeping in your own bed," Harry said, looking at the tattered mattress that had been laying on the floor, strewn with a few moth-eaten blankets to keep her warm. "Christ, Norma, how long have you been down here?" "Don't worry about that. I'm safe. If I was in my own bed now, I'd be dead. If not tomorrow, if not today, then tomorrow, or the day after." "Good set us up, Harry." "I know. I walked into a serious trap at his place. Barely made it out alive." "God, I'm sorry. It was damn convincing. I think I'm slipping. This would have never happened if I were a younger woman." "He got us both, Norma. He was working with some powerful magic. You know all the magicians have been murdered? One of them is still alive. Well, depending on your definition." "What?" "It's a long story, but I know who killed him. A demon. I met him at Good's house. He's a serious player." "Oh, Lord, I was afraid of that." "That's the other reason I'm holed up in this filthy place. I think they wanted to split us up. As soon as you left, my apartment was compromised. I felt the bad juju coming and I got the fuck out of there, but quick. There are roads open, Harry. Roads that should be closed. And there's something coming down one of those roads. Or maybe all of them. That means you and me and a whole lot of other people harm." "I believe it. But that doesn't change the fact that you can't stay here. This place is disgusting. We have to relocate you to some place where you won't be sleeping on the damp floor with rats running over your feet. Not to mention what's been done on that mattress. You can't see the stains, Norma, but there's a lot of them, in a variety of colors. You got a place in mind? As a matter of fact, I do. I'm going to get everything ready, and then I'm coming back for you, alright? If you say so. I do. I'll see you soon. We're gonna make it out of this thing, I promise. He gave her a gentle kiss on the cheek, and she caught hold. As he gave her a gentle kiss on the cheek, she caught hold of his hand. Why are you so good to me? She asked. As if you didn't know. Indulge me. Indulge me. Because there's nobody in the world who means more to me than you. And that's no indulgence. It's the plain truth. She smiled against his hand. Thank you, she said. Harry regarded her affectionately for a moment, and then without saying a word, turned and went in search of a safe haven. Well, hello. Welcome back, Nick. You're just in time for a break. We've just finished part 1 of the book, so I'm going to take a quick break, have a few bites to eat, and then I will be right back. Let's turn the music back up, and we'll continue on with the Scarlet Gospels. Alright. Had a quick bite. Now I'm back. Chat, do you need a recap at all? I don't know how many of you there are, or if it's just you again. Should I use your government name, or should I use, your username? It would probably be better to use your username while you're, because this will get uploaded to YouTube. I'm also going to turn the music down so I can actually be heard over it. Also, thank you for the sub. It's very kind of you. Maybe I'll do a recap anyways, since we're moving on to book 2 now. I mean, it calls it book 2. It's one book, but it's broken into three acts, I guess? Question mark. Funnily enough, actually that is exactly a third of the way through the book, so that makes sense. Is there a timer? Obviously, I'm reading, so very rarely do I catch a glimpse of the chat. Maybe that's what was popping up in the corner while I wasn't paying attention. But regardless, I may as well, just in case we edit this video in an interesting way. So we've finished book 1. Harry and Norma were set up by Good, the Phantom from the previous section. Harry has escaped. He narrowly escaped death twice in New Orleans. And now he is getting ready to batten down the hatches and protect his best friend, Norma Payne. Someone who means a lot to him. Of whom, the novel has clearly established, there are very few left. It is also kind of funny. The man is very quietly playing Breath of the Wild, and so all these horrific horror scenes from a Clive Barker book are happening while in the background Link goes around having fun little adventures. Alright, I don't see any reason not to keep going, so I'm gonna finish this cup of tea and then pour myself a new one. Wet my throat a bit. I do wish that Harry D'Amour... I wish Lord of the Illusions, the movie where Harry D'Amour shows up, had been more successful, because then we would have got more Scott Bakula as Harry D'Amour. I think Scott Bakula is perfect for Harry D'Amour. He gets the severity, but the kindness of the character exactly right. I've made the joke that the Scarlet Gospels is Clive Barker's version of a direct-to-video Hellraiser sequel. All right, that was delicious. Now, let's get the nice water pouring ASMR. Ooh yeah. The relaxing sound of water. All right, we shall continue. Except I'm going to adjust myself a bit. I'm going to adjust my book light. I'm actually going to move the mic as well. So that way it's more in front of me, so I can take a better pose. Adjust the book lamp a bit. Alright. If you're still awake, we're moving on. Book 2. Into the Breach. The ineffable thing has tied me to him, tows me with a cable. I have no knife to cut. Herman Melville, Moby Dick. 1. The monastery of the Cenobitical Order was a large walled compound built 700,000 years ago on a dam-made hill of stone and cement. It could only be entered by one route, a narrow stairway that was carefully watched by the monastery guards. It had been built in a time of imminent civil war, with factions of demons in constant skirmishes. The head of the Cenobitical Order, his identity known only to the 8 who had raised him from their number into that high office, had decided for the greater good of the Order that he would use a tiny part of the vast wealth they had accrued to build a fortress sanctuary, where his priests and priestesses would be safe from the volatile politics of hell. The fortress had been built to the most rigorous of standards, its polished grey walls unscalable. As the years had passed, and the Cenobites were less and less in the streets of the city that Lucifer had designed and built, a city called by some Pandemonium, but named Pyratha by its architect, the stories about what went on behind the sleek black walls of the Cenobitical fortress proliferated, and the countless demons and damned alike who glanced its way all had favorite stories about the excesses of its occupants. Between the monastery and Hell's great city, Pyratha, sat the vast shantytown called Fyke's Trench, where the damned who did service in the mansions, temples, and streets retired to sleep, eat, and yes, copulate, and if they were lucky, to produce an infant or two who could be sold at the abattoir, no questions asked. The stories of the fortress and the monstrous things that went on behind its wall were exchanged like currency, growing ever more elaborate. It was an understandable comfort to the damned, who lived with so much terror and atrocity in their daily lives, that there be a place where things were even worse, where they could look and tell themselves that their situation could be worse. And so each man, woman, and child nurtured acknowledgments that they were not among the victims of the fortress of the unspeakable devices of the Order, they were not among the victims of the fortress where the unspeakable devices of the Order would scour even the most treasured of memories. And in this fashion, the damned exist within a framework of something approximating life. Living in excrement and exhaustion, their bodies barely nourished, their spirits unfed, they indulged in the almost happy thought that at least a few others suffered more than they. All this had come as a shock to Theodore Felixson. In life, he'd spent so much of his fortune, his workings and magic. In life, he'd spent much of the fortune his workings and magic had earned him, what he'd like to refer to as his will-gotten gains, on art, always buying privately, because the paintings he collected moved, when they moved at all, outside the sniffing range of the museum hounds. All the pictures he'd owned had related in some way to hell. A Tintoretto of Lucifer falling, his wings torn from his body, trailing after him into the abyss. A sheaf of preparatory studies by Luca Signorelli for his fresco of the damned in hell. A book of horrors that Felixson had purchased in Damascus because its unknown creator had found a way to make the meditations of each hour turn on sin and punishment. These had been the most horrific pieces in his rather sizable collection on the subject of the infernal, and not one of them even remotely resembled the truth. There was an elegant symmetry to Pyratha, with its 8 hills, one better than Rome, its architect boasted, which were crammed with buildings of countless styles and sizes. Felixson knew nothing of the city's rules. Nothing of the city's rules, if it had any. The Hell Priest had referred to it in passing on one occasion, and only spoke of it with the contempt of a creature who thought every occupant of Pyratha as a subspecies, their mindless hedonism matched only by their lavish stupidity. The city that Lucifer had built to outdo Rome had fallen, as Rome had fallen, into decadence and self-indulgent, its regime too concerned with its own internal struggles to cleanse the city of its filth, and return it to the disciplined state it had been before Lucifer's disappearance. Yes, surprising. Yes, surprising as the architecture was. Excuse me, I'm gonna take that one more time. Yes, surprising as the architecture of hell was to Felixson, finding out that the angel who had been cast down from heaven for his rebellious ways was absent from his throne defied all expectations, even if it did make a certain amount of sense. As above, so below, Felixson thought. There were countless theories concerning Lucifer's disappearance, and Felixson had heard them all. Depending on which story you chose to believe, Lucifer had either gone mad and perished in the wastelands, escaping hell entirely, or was walking the streets of Pyratha disguised as a commoner. Felixson didn't believe any of it. He kept his opinions on the subject, and all other opinions, for that matter, to himself. He was lucky to be alive, he knew, and though the torturous surgeries had destroyed his ability to form an intelligible sentence, he was still fully capable of thinking clearly. If he bided his time and played his cards right, sooner or later, he knew, an escape route would present itself. And, when it did, he'd take it and be gone. He'd return to Earth, change his name and his face, and renounce magic for the rest of his days. That had been the plan, right up until he realized that living without power wasn't the nightmare he'd envisioned. He had been among the most accomplished and ambitious magicians in the world, but holding on to that position had taken staggering amounts of energy, will, and time. When he finally allowed himself to learn from the Cenobites, he discovered that the matters of his soul, the complex business of which had first drawn him into the mysteries of his craft, had been neglected entirely. It was only now, as a slave to a demon, that Felixson was free again to begin the long journey of self within self, the journey from which the getting of magic had distracted him. Living in hell kept him aware of the possibility of heaven, and he'd never felt more alive. Felixson stood at the bottom of the steps that led up to the gate of the fortress, with a message clutched firmly in his recently mangled hands. The epistle he held had been given to him by one of Hell's messengers, the only objectively beautiful beings in the underworld. They existed for the sole purpose of ensuring that Hell's dirtiest dealings always came wrapped in a pretty package. Ahead he could see Fyke's Trench, and beyond it, the whole of Pyratha. On the road heading towards him marched a small army of Hell's priests and priestesses, a procession of 36 of the Order's most formidable soldiers. Among them, Felixson was proud to say, stood his master. Felixson took his eyes off the smoking spires of the city and returned his gaze to the approaching procession of Cenobites. A wind had sprung up, or rather, the wind, for there was only one. It blew bitterly cold and stirred up the scents of rot and burnt blood that perpetually filled the air. Now, as the acrid wind grew in strength, gust by gust, it caught the black ceremonial robes of the Cenobites and unfurled the 30-foot flags of oiled human skin that several of the priests and priestesses held, so that the flags snaked and snapped high above their heads. The holes in the hides where the eyes and mouths had been looked to Felixson as though the victims were still staring, wide-eyed with disbelief at the sight of the flying knives that undid them, forever screaming as their skin was expertly stripped from muscle. The bell in the fortress tower, which was called a summoner, it was the same bell, in point of fact, that those who had opened Le Marchand's configuration always heard tolling far off, was now ringing to welcome back the brothers and sisters of the Order to the fortress. Upon seeing his master, Felixson knelt in the mud, head bowed so deferentially that it touched the ground as the procession climbed the steps to the fortress gate. With his head firmly planted in the dirt, Felixson extended his arm, the missive he carried held high in front of him. His lord stepped out of the procession to speak to Felixson, and the Cenobites continued to make their way past him. "What is this?" his lord said, snatching the letter from Felixson's hand. Felixson turned his muddy and divided head, twisting it to the left so he could study his lord's reaction with one eye. The Cenobite's face was inscrutable. Nobody knew how old he was. Felixson was smart enough not to ask, but the weight of his age sat upon his countenance, carving it into something that could never be manufactured, only chiseled by the agonies of loss and time. Felixson's tongue rolled out of his head, landing in the mud and shit-caked street. He didn't seem to mind. He was enthralled to his master. "I am called to the chamber of the unconsumed," the Hell Priest said, staring down at the letter in his hand. Without another word, the Cenobite turned against the tide of the members of his order and moved toward Pryratha. Felixson followed, naive to the details, but loyal to the end. 2. After the filth of the trench, the streets of Hell's City were comparatively clean. They were wide, and in places, planted with some species of trees that needed no sunlight to survive. Their black trunks and branches, and even the dark blue leaves that sprang from them, gnarled and twisted as though every inch of their growth had been born in convulsion. There were no cars on the streets, but there were bicycles, sedan chairs, and rickshaws, even a few carriages drawn by horse that had almost transparent skin and fleshless heads so flat and wide, their eyes set on either edge of these expanses of bone, that they resembled manta rays stitched upon the bodies of asses. In the streets, word of the Cenobite's appearance went out before him, and at each intersection, even the busiest traffic was held up by demons in dark purple uniforms, the closest thing Pryratha had to a police force, so that the Cenobite could make his way through the city undeterred by a single citizen. As he passed, most of the citizens either made signs of devotion, touching navel, breastbone, and middle brow before inclining their heads, or if officers went down on their knees to demonstrate their veneration. It wasn't just hybrids and demons who dropped to the ground, so did many of the damned. The Hell Priest paid them no heed, but Felixson drank it all in. Up close, the buildings they hurried past seemed even more impressive to Felixson than they had from the hill upon which sat the monastery. Their facades were decorated with what looked like intricately rendered scenes of Lucifer's personal mythologies. The figures were designed to be contained within a rigorous square format, which brought to Felixson's mind the decorations he'd once seen on the temples of the Incas and Aztecs. There was every kind of activity pictured in these decorations: wars, celebrations, and even lovemaking, all very graphically depicted. As he paced a long period in the hushed and claustrophobic streets of the fortress, only able to see the city for a few stolen minutes, now and then, it gave Felixson a sense of something vaguely resembling contentment to be given so much to feast his eyes upon. "There," the Hell Priest said, tearing Felixson from his reverie. Felixson looked up to see the Cenobite pointing at what was easily the tallest building in the city. It rose higher than the eye could see, piercing the pitch-black sky. For all its enormity, the building was entirely void of detail. A windowless, featureless spike, its facade was the very essence of mundanity. The palace was a true work of art. A building so bland it wasn't even appealing enough to be considered an eyesore. It was a joke, Felixson guessed. Its architect found quite amusing. As they came to within 3 steps of the summit, a door opened inward, though there was nobody visibly doing the job. Felixson noticed the tiniest tremor in the Hell Priest's hand. The Cenobite cast his lightless eyes up at the stone spectacle that rose high above them, and then said, "I am here to be judged. If the judgment goes against me, you are to destroy every one of my endeavors. Do you understand?"
"Everything?"
Felixson said. "Don't succumb to sentiment. I have all I need here." He tapped his temple with the broken and poorly reset forefinger of his right hand. "Nothing will be lost."
"I do, master. I do can."
The Cenobite offered a subtle approving nod, and together they stepped inside. 3. The palace of the Unconsumed was devoid of any features, inside as it was outside. The foyer was thick with infernal bureaucrats in grey suits tailored to accommodate whatever physical defect afflicted the damned. One, with a ring of football-sized tumors growing out of his back, had his suit neatly encircling each of the pulsing protuberances. Some wore fabric hoods that reduced their expression to 2 small eye holes and a horizontal rectangle for their mouths. There were sigils sewn into the fabric, their significance outside of Felixson's field of knowledge. The drab passages were lit with large bulbs, the light they gave off never entirely solid but flickering, no, fluttering, as though the source of the light was alive inside. After turning the corners of the passageway 6 times, each one of them committed to memory by Felixson, they came out into a place of startling splendor. Felixson had assumed the entire building was a hive of featureless corridors, but he was wrong. This area was an open space, bathed in light, and consisting only of a single reflective metal tube, perhaps 10 feet wide, that ran all the way up from the floor to the ceiling, which were set so far above their heads it remained unseen. The Cenobite pointed towards the darkness above them and said a single word. There. Their ascent was accomplished via a wide spiral staircase that sat within the reflective tube. Each of the metal steps were welded to its core, but even here in this elegant construct the infernal touch hadn't been neglected. Each of the steps was set not at 90 degrees to the core, but at 97, or 100, or 105, each one different from the one before, but all sending out the same message. Nothing was certain here. Nothing was safe. There was no railing to break the slide should someone lose their footing. Only step after disquieting step, designed to make the ascent as vertiginous as possible. The Cenobite, however, was defiant. Rather than climb the stair close to the column, where he could at least enjoy the illusion of safety, he ascended, hewing always to the open end of the step, as if daring fate to take its due. Sometimes the preceding step had been crafted so as to incline more precipitously, and ascending to the next step took a considerable length of stride. Yet somehow the Hell Priest managed to make the climb with effortless dignity, leaving Felixson to follow behind, clinging desperately to the core. Halfway into their journey, he started to count the stairs. Felixson got to 389 before the Hell Priest disappeared from sight. Nearly breathless, Felixson continued his ascent and found an archway, more than twice his height, at the top of the stairs. The Cenobite had already stepped through it, and was surprised to find that there was no guard, at least none visible, at the threshold. Felixson went on after his master, keeping his head declined so that he couldn't see anything of the chamber into which his master had led him. Felixson saw that they were in a large dome, which was surely 200 feet high at its apex, although with his head bowed it was difficult to judge accurately. The entire chamber seemed to be carved from white marble, including the floor, which was icy cold beneath the soles of his feet, and though he did his best to keep from making a sound, the dome picked up every tiny hint and lobbed its echoes back and forth before adding them to the reservoir of murmurs and steps and quiet weepings that ran like a gutter around the farthest edge of the floor. "Far enough," somebody said, the command following 1,000 tapering echoes. A breath-cremating heat came at Felixson and the priest from the center of the dome. The only object in the circular room was a throne so far beyond the dimensions of a piece of ordinary furniture that it deserved a better, as yet uninvented word. The thing was made of solid blocks of metal, 9 or 10 inches thick, one slab for the high back, one for each arm, one for the seat, and a fifth running parallel with the arm slabs, but set beneath the seat. Flammable gases blazed from 6 long, wide vents, one on every side of the throne and 2 directly beneath it. They burned with sapphire flames, which intensified into an aching white, flecked with red motes at their cores. The gases rose high above the back of the flame, which was itself easily 10 feet tall, and drew together, braiding themselves into a single column. The heat inside the dome would have been lethal had the dome not been pierced with several concentric rings of holes, housing powerful fans as to extract the excess heat. Directly above the throne, the chamber's spotless white marble was scorched black. As for the throne itself, it was virtually white-hot, and sitting in it, his pose formal, was the creature whose indifference to the blaze had given him his apt moniker, the Unconsumed. Felixson had heard of him in whispers. Whatever color his skin had originally been, his body was now blackened by heat. His vestments and his shoes, if he had ever worn them, and his staff of office, if he ever carried one, had burned away. So too all the hair from his head, face, and body. Yet somehow the rest of him, his skin, flesh, and bone, was unaffected by the volcanic heat in which he sat. The Hell Priest stopped in his tracks. Felixson did the same, and even though he had been given no order, he went down on his knees.
Cenobite, do you know why you have been summoned?
No.
Come closer. Let me better see your face.
The Cenobite approached, perhaps within 6 strides of the throne, showing no concern for the incredible heat that emanated from the spot. If he felt it, he showed no sign.
Tell me of magic, Cenobite,
the Unconsumed said. His voice sounded like flame, steady and clean, but for those flickering motes of scarlet. A human artifice, my sovereign, yet another of man's inventions designed to grasp divinity. Then why should it concern you? It wasn't the Unconsumed who spoke, but a fourth presence in the chamber. An abbot of the Cenobitical order made his presence known as he emerged from the shadows behind the Unconsumed's throne, and made his way at processional speed across the chamber. He carried the staff of the High Union, which was fashioned after a shepherd's crook, shouting condemnations as he approached. Behind his back, the abbot had commonly been called the Lizard, a nickname he'd earned from the countless scales of polished silver, each set with a jewel that had been hammered into every visible inch of his flesh, assumed to cover his entire body. We have found your books, priest. Obscene volumes of desperate workings of men. It is heresy. You are part of an order, the abbot continued, answerable to its laws only. Why have you been keeping secrets? I know. You know nothing, the abbot said, slamming his rod into the cold marble, punishing the Cenobite's ears with its din. A Cenobite is to work within the system. You seem content to work outside that system. As of this moment, you are exiled from the order. Very well. And personally, the abbot continued, I would have you executed. But the final judgment lies with the Unconsumed.
And I see no punishment in execution, said
the Unconsumed.
You are never again to set foot in the monastery. Your belongings have been confiscated. You are banished to the trench. What happens to you there is not my concern.
Thank you, said the Hell Priest. He bowed, and then turned his head for the archway. Wordlessly, he and his servant exited. Wordlessly, he and his servant exited the chambers, and began the long descent. Four. Kaz kept odd hours, but there was an emergency buzzer hidden in a niche in the brickwork beside the front door, which only a select group of people knew about. Harry used it now. There was some static on the intercom, and then, Kaz isn't home right now. It's D'Amour. Let me in. Who? Harry D'Amour. Who? Harry sighed. Harold. 60 seconds later, Harry was sitting in Kaz's overstuffed sofa, which occupied fully a quarter of his living room. Another significant fragment was taken up by books, his places in them marked. His subjects of interest could scarcely have been more eclectic. Forensic pathology, the life of Herman Melville, the Franco-Prussian War, Mexican folklore, Pasolini's murder, Mapplethorpe's self-portraits, the prisons of Louisiana, Serbo-Croatian puppeteers, and so on. The towers of book looked like a bird's-eye view of a major metropolitan city. Harry knew the etiquette of the books. You could pick something out of the stacks and flip through it, but it had to go back in the same place. You could even borrow them, but the price of a late return was always something disgusting. Of all the men Harry had ever called his friend, Kaz was easily the most intimidating. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall, his body a mass of lean, tattooed muscle, a good portion of it done in Japan by the master who taught Kaz the skill. Kaz wore a coat of ink and color that stopped only at his neck, wrists, and ankles. Its designs a compendium of classic Japanese subjects. On his back was a samurai in close combat with a demon, its rain-lashed bamboo grove. 2 dragons ascended. I'm going to take that a little slower. On his back was a samurai in close combat with a demon, in a rain-lashed bamboo grove. 2 dragons ascended his legs, their tongues interwoven as they wrapped around the length of his dick. He was bald and clean-shaven, and had anyone caught sight of him coming out of the bar at 2 a.m, shirtless and sweaty, they would have stepped out onto the street rather than get in his way on the sidewalk. He cut an intimidating figure, to be sure, but one glance in his face, and it was a different story. Kaz found some source of delight in everything, and as a result, he had an unmatched kindness in his eyes. There was scarcely a time when Kaz wasn't smiling or laughing out loud, the one significant exception being that portion of his day he spent drilling pictures and words onto other people's bodies. "Harold, my man, you look serious," Kaz said. Kaz said to Harry, using a nickname only Harry allowed him. "Harold, my man, you look serious," Kaz said, using a nickname Harry allowed him and only him to use. "What's troubling you?" "If I'm going to answer that question, I need a drink first." Kaz prepared his specialty, Benedictine with a pinch of cocaine, in the little office behind the store, and Harry told him everything that had happened so far. Every damn bit of it, sometimes reaching back to his earliest encounters. "And then there's this thing with Norma," he said to Kaz. "I mean, they got us both, you know. How could we both have been fooled? I rarely see her frightened, Kaz. Maybe twice in my life, but never like this. Never hiding in some shithole because she's afraid of what's going to come for her." "Well, we can get her out of there tonight, if you like, my man. We can bring her here, make her feel comfy. She'll be safe." "No, I know they're watching." "Then they must be keeping their distance then," Kaz said, "because I haven't had a twinge." He turned his palms over, where two of his synthesized alarm sigils had been inked by an ex-lover of his in Baltimore. "I haven't felt anything either," said Harry. "But that might mean they're getting smarter. Maybe they're running some interference signal, you know, to block our alarms. They're not stupid." "And neither are we," said Kaz. "We'll try to get her somewhere safe. Somewhere," he trailed off, and a grin appeared on his face. "In Brooklyn." "Brooklyn? Trust me, I know just the person. I'm gonna go over there now. You go back to Norma. I'll call you when everything's ready." "I don't have a phone," Harry said. "Lost in the demolition." "Fine," Kaz said. "I'll knock. Any idea how many are after you guys?" Harry shrugged. "No, I can't even figure out why they chose now. I've been in the same office since I started out, and she's been in that same apartment doing her thing all these years. There was never any trouble from the pit before. What do you think they want?" "You," Kaz said. "Plain and simple." "What?" Harry said. "No, if they wanted me, they'd come for me. Christ knows they do it often enough." "Yeah," said Kaz, "but they always fail." Harry came back to the basement sex club to find... Oh, I'm actually going to take a drink, and then I'm going to... I don't know why I bother describing what I'm doing. That's not how real radio shows work. The nighttime DJ isn't like, "And now I'm going to take a walk over to the bathroom." No, he just plays it.
listen to the scuzz and fuzz in the morning. And, oh, hang on a second.
No.
I'm gonna drink some water.
Midnight radio hosts are never like that. They're never like, hey, it's me, I'm Scott the Buzz, I'm gonna be loud. No, they're always like, alright, it's midnight. I know that you're all out there in the graveyard shift doing whatever it is you do. You know, most people who are up late at night are usually like at a job of some kind. Taxi drivers or, what do you call them? Nurses or doctors or something. I think I'm too close to the mic. I think I'm peaking. Alright. 5. Harry came back to the basement of the sex club to find Norma in conversation with a ghost she introduced to Harry as Nails McNeil, who had not come in search of Norma, but had wandered in on a lark to reacquaint himself with his favourite old stomping ground. He loved getting crucified at the summer and winter solstices, Norma told Harry. Norma listened while the invisible presence added something onto this. He says you should try it, Harry. A crucifixion and a good blowjob. Heaven on earth. Thanks, Nails, Harry said. But I think I'll stick to good... Thanks, Nails, Harry said. But I think I'll stick to plain old masturbation. On that note, while we wait for Kaz to get here, I'm going to settle down for a couple of hours of sleep on the stage next door. The scene of many of Mr. McNeil's finest hours, no doubt. He says, sweet dreams. That's pretty much out of the question, but it's the thought that counts. I brought some food, Norma, and a pillow, and some brandy, too. Oh my stars, Harry. You shouldn't have gone through so much trouble, and you don't need to stay, either. I'm perfectly fine. Indulge me. Norma smiled. We'll keep our chatting down, she said. Here was a first, Harry thought as he tossed the pillow down on the stage in preparation of sleeping beneath a cross on boards that had no doubt seen their share of bodily fluids. There was probably something significant about that, he thought vaguely, but he was too damn tired to get very far with the notion. Sleep overcame him quickly, and despite Nails McNeil's good-night wish, Harry's dream, in the singular, was not sweet. He passed the dazed hours dreaming he was in the back of the cab that had brought him here. Only the familiar streets of New York were now near wasteland, and his driver, far from ignorant of whatever was pursuing them, simply said over and over, "Whatever you do, don't look back." 6. The Hell Priest left the fortress and exited the city without a word, Felixson following closely behind. Only when they finally reached the threshold of the monastery did the Hell Priest speak. "Do you see that stand of trees a mile to our left?" "Yes." "Go and wait. I will come for you." They separated once they were inside the gates. Under ideal circumstances, the Hell Priest would have seen his duties accomplished at a more leisurely pace than he'd now been obliged to accept. But he was ready to move, for there had been many years of preparation, and it was a relief to finally have the grim business before him under way. When he thanked the Unconsumed, he had been sincere. All of what he was about to do depended on possessing much magic, of course. That had been the key to this endeavor from the beginning, and it was no small pleasure to him to discover that most of his fellow Cenobites, if the subject of magic and its efficacy were to be brought up in conversation, had nothing but contempt for it. That fact made what was about to happen all the more ironic. He went directly to the row of anonymous buildings that ran along the wall on the far edge of the fortress, where the slope on the far edge of the fortress, where the slope on which it stood fell away. They were called channel houses. To compensate for the gradient, the wall on that side was twice as high as at the front, the top of it crammed with iron spikes that pointed in, out, and up. These were in turn covered with barbs that had snared hundreds of birds, many of them caught in the process of picking at earlier victims. Here and there, among the iron and the bones, were a few recent captives, occasionally fluttering frantically for a few seconds, and then settling again to gather strength for another futile attempt at freedom. The original purpose of the Channel House had long been forgotten. Many of them were completely empty. Some were repositories of the chainmail aprons and gloves that had been used for the vivisections of the damned, the blood-gummed equipment tossed and left to the flies. Even they, having fed and bred several generations there, had exhausted the usefulness of the stuff, and had gone. Nobody now came there, except the Hell Priest, and even he had only come twice, once to elect a hiding place for his own contributions to the Order's tradition of torment, the other to actually hide them away. In point of fact, it had been the sight of the birds on top of the wall that had inspired the simple but elegant solution of how he could bring the news he had spent many months of study refining, to its recipients. Using the lethal knowledge he had culled from his researches and the only book in his secret library that did not concern magic, Senbazu Orikata, or How to Fold 1,000 Cranes, the oldest known volume on the art of origami, he had gone about his secret work with an eagerness he had not remembered feeling for the better part of a human lifetime. Now, as he entered the 6th charnel house, where his labours lay sleeping in a large bird-cage, he felt that eagerness once again, chastened by the knowledge that there would be neither time nor opportunity to do this twice, so he could not afford error. Since he'd first brought his secret work here, the Order had swelled in number, a circumstance he had planned for. He had to fold the new identities into his flock with a fine brush and ink called cindered scale. This would take only a few more minutes, and as he worked, he listened for any sounds, besides those of the dying birds, a whisper, a footfall, any sign that he was being sought. But inscribing the execution writs on the extra papers he'd folded and left unmarked for this very situation was finished without interruption. He put the papers together in a cage with the others. He had crafted. As he did so, a feeling of almost utterly foreign to him insinuated itself into his thoughts. Puzzled, he struggled to name it. What was it? He made a hushed grunt of recognition when the answer came. It was doubt. But as to its source, he was woefully ignorant. He wasn't doubting the efficacy of the working in which he was about to engage. He was certain it would more than suffice, nor was he doubting its mode of delivery. So what was it that troubled him? He stared down into the cage of folded paper birds while he puzzled over his unwanted emotion, and all at once it became clear. The doubt was rooted in certainty. Certainty that once the magic he had labored over in this room was free to go about its business, there was no turning back. The world he had known for almost as far back as his memory stretched was about to change out of all recognition. He was moments from unleashing utter chaos, and doubt was simply reminding him of that fact. It was testing him. It was asking of him, "Are you ready for the apocalypse?" He heard the question in his head, but he answered it with his lips. "Yes," he said. With the doubt defined and replied to, he went on with his work, picking up the cage and taking it to the door, which he opened as he set the cage down on its threshold. For safety's sake, he took a gutting knife from his belt, prepared for the unlikely event he would be interrupted. Then he spoke the words, which were African in origin, and had taken him some time to master, punctuated as they were with grunts and delicate expulsions of breath. The Hell Priest watched the cage as he spoke. The incantation sometimes required a second or even a third repetition, so he was drawing breath to repeat the syllables when a slight shift in the heap of folded papers. When there was a slight shift in the heap of folded papers, it was followed, almost immediately, by another movement, and another. The urge to live, spreading through the occupants of the cage. In less than a minute, nearly 100 origami cranes came alive, flapping their paper wings. The only sound they were capable of making was the one they were making now, paper rubbing against paper, fold against fold. They knew what they'd been made to emulate, and they fluttered against the door in their hunger for release. The hell beasts had no intention of releasing them all at once. That risked too much attention being drawn to their source. He opened the cage and let fewer than 10 of them go. They hopped around on their folded feet, stretching their wings as they did so. Then, as though by mutual consent, they all beat their paper wings, took flight, and rose up above the channel houses. 3 of them landed on the roof of the channel house, on the roof of Channel House 6, cocking their heads to stare back down at their caged brethren. The remainder, having circled the channel house once to orient themselves, flew off, and the remaining 3 who came to perch on the gutters followed seconds later. The spectacle of the first few departing had driven the other 90 or so that were still in the cage into a mad frenzy. "Your turn will come," the Hell Priest said to them. If they understood him, they chose not to take notice. They flapped and fought and repeatedly flung themselves against the bars. Despite the weight of the iron cage and their own frailty, they still managed to make the cage shake. The priest opened the door a couple of inches and let another dozen out, quickly latching the door again to watch what the second group would do. As he suspected, not one of them wasted time perching on the channel house roof, as the 3 from the first group had done. Instead, they all flew up immediately, circling around to orient themselves before going their various ways. The cold, hard wind was blowing again, and the priest watched as the folded birds that looked like scraps of paper billowing in front of the chaotic streets of the city, knowing that anything more than a cursory glance would break the illusion. For the scraps were not in thrall to any specific wind. They were obviously flying in very different and very precise directions. With the gift of this illusory wind, he decided to throw caution to the wind and let all of the birds have their freedom. He tore the cage door off its simple hinges, and the bars broke where they were welded to the framework of the cage. He pulled the front of it away, standing clear of it as the paper flock rose up in a chaotic tangle of folded wings and beaks. None of them languished. They had work to do, and they were eager to do it. They rose up after a few seconds and hopped or fluttered to the doorway. From there they set off to do their work. The whole business, from his tearing open the cage to liberate the birds, to the departure of the last of them, had taken perhaps 3 minutes. He didn't have long now. As a result, he didn't wait in the channel house, but headed out at a brisk walk, so as to be seen on the busier paths that ran between the blocks of the cells. In doing so, however, he was not providing himself with an alibi. In point of fact, he had no need of one, because in a short time none of those who saw him there would be alive to testify. His only concern was that the presence of the birds would be discovered. But, to his satisfaction, their existence went unnoticed by his brothers and sisters. He was wonderfully alive in those glorious minutes of anticipation. His senses quaking, he climbed the steps to the wall above the gate and looked across the city. The usual fires were burning here and there, and on the second closest bridge he saw a violent crash between the regime's guard in their black and silver uniforms and an unruly mass of citizens who were forcing the guard's retreat by simple superiority of numbers. Homemade firebombs were lobbed among the guards and emptied in sprays of orange flame, the victims dousing the fire by throwing themselves off the bridge into the water. But the fire was immune to its oldest enemy, and the burning guards would dive deep to extinguish the flame, only to surface and instantaneously reignite. He could hear the guards shrieking as they were consumed. It was business as usual. But then a cry came from much nearer. He heard a wail emanate from within the monastery behind him. Before it died away, there were another 2, and almost immediately 3 or 4 more. None were cries of pain, of course. These were souls who had lived in a state of perpetual self-elected agony so as to earn a place within the order. And the execution that the Hell Priest had composed was designed for efficiency, not indulgence. When one of the Hell Priest's paper soldiers found its intended victim, the writ's baleful influence took effect, and when that happened, they had only 8 or 9 heartbeats left to them, each one weaker than the one that preceded it, The shouts he heard were of disbelief and rage, and none of them lasted very long. There was panic among those who worked for the dead and the dying members of the order. However, the damned, who, like Felixson, had slavishly served their masters in any way, were called upon to do so. Now their masters were falling down, their mouths frosting, and the slaves were crying out for help, only to find that the same thing was likely happening in every other chamber of the monastery. The Hell Priest finally entered the monastery, walking the pathways between the cell blocks, looking left and right, but only fleetingly. His brothers and sisters were in their last death throes. Priests, priestesses, deacons, and bishops all lay where they had fallen, some at the threshold, as if all they'd needed was a breath of fresh air, others visible only as an outstretched limb seen through a half-closed door. What they all had in common, these many dead, was blood. It had been expelled from their bodies with convulsive force, just as the Hell Priest had planned in his drawing of the writs. The death spasms he had willed upon them were a cruelty of his own invention, and only plausible because the laws of magic were doing to the bodies what nature could not. Once the writs reached their victim, they reconfigured in a matter of seconds the organization of their innards, so that the bodies became blood-filled pitchers, disgorging everything in 2, or at most 3 convulsions. Only 2 times as he walked around the cell blocks did he confront living victims. On the first occasion, somebody caught the hem of his vestments. He looked down to see a priestess with whom he had worked several times in the collecting of souls. She was in extremis, pouring blood forth from every pore in her body. He quickly pulled the robes from her weakening grasp, and moved along quickly. On the second occasion, he heard someone call out from a cell he was passing. There he saw, leaning against the wall a foot or so from the door, an excessively corpulent brother in black spectacles, whom he had never liked, nor been liked by in turn. "This is your doing," the cumbersome priest said from within the cell. "You are mistaken," the Hell Priest said. "Traitor!" He was raising his voice as he became more certain of his accusations, and rather than encourage him to shout still louder by moving on, the Hell Priest stepped into the cell, fully prepared to dispatch the accusing Cenobite with hook in hand. Once inside, the Hell Priest saw the unfolded remains of his execution writ lying on the floor. For some reason, perhaps because of the great weight of his corpulent brother's body, it had not yet taken effect on him. "Murderer," the fat one said. This time he didn't shout his accusation, though he clearly wished to, for his face had suddenly grown pale, and loud noises stemmed from his innards. Death was seconds away. The Hell Priest backed away from his dying brother. As he did so, 2 things happened simultaneously. The fat one reached out and caught hold of the front of the Hell Priest's vestments, and then he convulsed, and his obese body disgorging a stream of hot blood that hit the Hell Priest's face with such force that it stung his flesh. The Hell Priest took hold of the fat one's hand, and with a single squeeze broke all of his fingers in a bid to free himself from the grasp. Before he could liberate himself, there was a second convulsion, more powerful than the first. The contents washed over the Hell Priest like a tidal wave, and the dying obese brother slid down against the wall, his grip on his murderer weakened as his life finally gave out. The Hell Priest turned his back on his brother and left the cell, emerging into the tumultuous halls, his bloodied condition no bad disguise. He'd decided he'd seen more than enough, not because the sights overwhelmed him. He was, in fact, quite proud to see the successful fruits of his labors. But this was only the first part of his plan. It had gone off without a hitch, and now it was time to move away from here and attend to his rendezvous with Felixson. But as the Hell Priest came in sight of the fortress gate, one of which was open a little way, he met, or rather heard, the third survivor. "Stand still, priest," said a weakened voice. He did as he was commanded. Looking off to his right, saw the abbot, semi-recumbent, being pushed in a 2-wheeled vehicle, attended by physicians who administered to him from all sides. The abbot's weakened frame had been aggregated by the spillage of great blood down his reptilian chin, and out the front of his exquisitely decorated robes. Blood still trickled from the corners of his mouth, and negotiated its way between the scales of metal and gems. More came when he spoke, but he cared not. He had survived the torment that had left the whole of his unholy order dead, all except for himself, and the other who stood before him. He studied the Hell Priest, his golden eyes ringed with small scales set in sapphires, giving away no clue to his thoughts. Finally he said, "Are you immune to this sickness that has taken us?" "No," the Hell Priest said. "My belly is twisted up, and I am bleeding." "Liar! Liar!" He pushed the attendants away from him left and right, and stepped off the device that brought him here, coming at the Hell Priest with startling speed. "You did this! You murdered your own order! I smell their blood on you!" The jewels flickered with color, rubies and sapphires and emerald, concealing completely the rotting body beneath. "Confess it, priest! Save yourself the stink of your own flesh burning!" "This is no longer my order," the Hell Priest said. "I am but a citizen of the trench, come to collect my belongings." "Guards, arrest him, and summon the Inquisitors from—" The orders were silenced by the Hell Priest's hand over his throat. The priest lifted him up, which was no small feat but for the heaviness of the jewelry that added to the abbot's body weight was substantial. Still, the priest lifted him and pressed him against one of the cell-block walls. With his free hand, he scraped at the abbot's decorations, digging his fingers beneath the silver and jewels, adorning his face and tearing them away. The abbot's flesh was soft with rot beneath, like soap too long left in hot water, and when the priest began to remove the carapace, it came away readily. In a matter of seconds, he had exposed half the abbot's face. It was a pitiful sight, the flesh barely adhering to the bone. And yet there was no fear in the abbot's eyes. He drew breath enough through the priest's stranglehold to say, "It seems we are united by a secret. You are not the only one with magic to wield. I am alive now only because of workings I prepared many years ago. You can kill me, but I promise I will take you with me." He stared unblinking into the Hell Priest as he declared his immunity, and the Hell Priest knew his promise to be true, but he could already feel the connection to the abbot. He could already feel the connection the abbot was forging between them. There is much I can do short of your destruction," the Hell Priest said.
And the longer you take to do it, the closer the Inquisitors get."
The Hell Priest stared into the abbot's eyes. Finally he dropped the abbot to the ground. "Another day, then," the Hell Priest said, and made his exit. The Hell Priest arrived at the edge of the forest, and found Felixson waiting for him, loyal dog that he was.
"Is done?"
Felixson said. "Yes," the Hell Priest said, looking back as a fresh din kicked from the fortress. There was some confusion around the gates, an argument about whether they should be left open for the dignitaries or be closed against the hoi polloi. It was a consequence of what he'd done that he'd not foreseen. The order had always jealously preserved its privileged state, executing outside the gates anyone who had violated the law or entered without the mandatory triple-signed permission papers. But it would be impossible to seal the fortress and its secrets off from prying eyes now. There were too many corpses that would need to be tended to, too much blood to clean up. And with the abbot in the state of mental instability in which he'd been left, there wasn't a single authority in the fortress. In time, a few absentee Cenobites would return, having by chance escaped the slaughter, and the predictable infighting would begin. But for now, there were only a few confused guards at the gate, the dead inside, the damned who'd served them, and no doubt a swelling congregation of flies. Tonight's tea is too lemony. Last night's tea was nice and lemony. Tonight's tea is too lemony. Alright. 7. Harry? Harry opened his eyes and sat up. Norma was at the edge of the stage. Are you awake? I am now. What's wrong? Somebody's trying to get in, Harry. The spirits are doing their best, but they say they can't keep him out much longer. How many are there? 2. What do you want to do? I want to take a piss. He came back from the bathroom break with a bottle of brandy in hand. He took a hit off the bottle, handed it to Norma, and made his way up the stairs to the front door. The alcohol had quite a kick, and, with nothing to soak it up, he all but lost his footing on the darkened stairs as he ascended. But he got to the top without breaking any bones, slid the bolts aside, and opened the right-hand door. There was no way to do it quietly. The door grated over the accrual of debris as he opened it. It was still dark outside, which meant Harry couldn't have been sleeping for very long. Norma's ghosts, he sensed, had come with him, and he addressed his invisible companions as he climbed the garbage-strewn steps to street level. I'm not getting any twitches. That's a good sign. But if something goes the wrong way, get back to Norma and get her out the back way, okay? The fire exit had chains on it, but I broke them, figuring you'd have your pals watching the alley. So you just get going with her. Don't wait for me. I can look after myself, and I'll find you wherever you end up. I hope to God one of you is listening, because if I ever lost her... He trailed off there, unable to give voice to his fear. He was at the top of the steps now, and rather than loiter outside the hideaway, he wandered to the intersection, checking in all directions. There was no one around, and the traffic was light. He idled around the block, pausing to light up the stub of a cigar, which he felt, contrary to the connoisseurs who wouldn't touch anything that had been near a flame, was nicely pungent after a couple hours of being smoked, then tenderly put out, smoked again, then extinguished once more. Now it was ripe as an old sock, and nurturing it to life gave Harry the perfect excuse for lingering here and assessing the state of the street. He got to the end of the far side of the block and pulled on his cigar, only to find that it had conveniently died on him again. He took out a tattered book of matches he had in his jacket pocket and tore one match off, to give himself a nice hot flame to rekindle his stinker. As he bent his head to the task, his peripheral vision caught sight of a man and a woman approaching him from the north end of the block. The woman was small but fierce-looking. The bald man at her side was easily 1.5 feet taller than she. It was Kaz, and he brought company. Harry drew on his cigar to get a good, fragrant cloud going. He glanced in their direction, but did nothing that could be construed as a signal. Then, turning his back on them, he retraced his path around the building, waiting till Kaz and company had turned the corner, at which point Harry headed back down the garbage-littered steps and waited. Only when they reached the top of the flight and began their descent did Harry go inside and wait for them to follow. Harry met Kaz's friend once before. He remembered her name was Lana. She was barely 5 feet tall, but every inch of her was solid muscle. Her body had more ink on it than Harry and Kaz's combined, but it wasn't because of her passion for the art of form. Every bit of her skin, face included, was a living, breathing scroll, an encyclopedia of arcane writs and sigils that, she said, barely kept the spirits at bay. The woman was a magnet for the supernatural. Harry was happy to see her. I brought her along just in case we had some problems, Kaz said when he entered the building. Hi, Harry, Lana said. Good to see you again. She extended her hand, which Harry took. Her grip almost crushed his fingers. Lana, Harry said, the epitome of restraint. She's got an apartment. She'll let us have it for as long as we need. Anything for Norma, Lana said. So let's get her moved, shall we? Kaz said. I've got my van parked just down the street. Shall I bring it around? Yeah. We'll be up here by the time he stopped. Then quietly said, Damn. Visitors? Lana said, eyes darting around as she took in the surroundings. Something. I just felt a twitch in the ink, but it's gone. Could have been something passing over. You never know in this damn city. Let's just get the lady out of this shithole. 5 minutes, Kaz? 5'll do her. Lana, you come with me. You got it, boss man. Harry detected a note of sarcasm in her voice, but chose to ignore it as he guided her back through the dimly lit maze. Jesus, Mary and Joseph, Norma said as they came into her room. What are you doing here? Sorry, he said he was a friend of yours, Lana said. You know I'm talking to you, Norma said. I'm not going to let you get sick, Norma. A lot of people depend on you, me included, so we've decided that you're staying at my place. Harry winced, waiting for Norma to come back at Lana with some objection, but she just sat there, a smile forming on her face. What's so funny? Harry said. Nothing, Norma said. It's just nice to have you all bullying me around for my own good. So we're having a pajama party? Lana said. Yes, we are, Norma said. No arguments? Said Harry. Nope. She was still smiling. Sadomasochistic ghosts are one thing, said Harry. But this is weird. 8. There was a goodly number of signs that something of substantial consequence was about to happen in New York tonight. For those with the sense to read the signs, or hear them, or smell them, they were everywhere. In the subtle elegance of the steam that rose from the manholes on several avenues, in the pattern of gasoline spilled from every automobile collision that involved a fatality, in the din of tens of thousands of birds circling over the trees in Central Park, where every other night they would have been sleeping and silent at this hour, and in the prayers of the homeless souls muttered as they lay concealed for safety's sake where the garbage was foulest. The churches stayed open through the night hours for those in need of a place to calm their hearts. The churches that stayed open through the night. One more time. The churches that stayed open through the night. The churches that stayed open through the night hours for those who in need of a place to calm their hearts saw more souls than they would surely see in half a year. There's no pattern to these men and women, black and white, shoeless and well-heeled, until it was the fact that tonight they'd all wish they could cut from their mind's configuration the part that had always known, since infancy, that the great wound of the world was deepening, day on day, and they had no choice but to feel the hurt as if it was their own, which of course, in part, it was. The trip to Brooklyn had been eventless so far. Kaz had taken Canal Street and crossed the Manhattan Bridge. We're heading for Underhill Avenue, Lana said, as Kaz brought them over to the bridge on Flatbush. Left on Dean Street, go straight 4 blocks, then right. Holy goddamn shit, stop the van, Harry said in a single breath. What is it? Kaz said. Just stop! Kaz put on the brakes. Harry looked at the rearview mirror, studying what he saw there, as he murmured, What the hell is he doing there? Who? More than one voice demanded. From the cover of Hell's Timberland, the Hell Priest would happily have lingered and watched how the farce of death was developing within his former place of residence, but he had more urgent business. He took 3 strides, which brought him to the barbed thicket that surrounded the forest, marking its end. Its gnarled branches were so intricately intertwined that it looked as solid as a wall. The Cenobite thrust his hands into the knotted thicket, the barbs tearing open his flesh. He pushed in as deep as his wrist, and then he grasped the tangled branches and pulled them hard. There were several small flashes of white light from the severed branches, and they spread outwards in all directions. Felixson watched in awe. He'd seen plenty of workings more spectacular than this, but to feel the power it was generating, that was worthy of his wonderment. The thicket grove was in the transforming grip of his master's energy, and its brambles were suddenly pliant and swaying like thorny seaweed in the grip of a furious tide. Seconds before it happened, Felixson could feel the old feeling in his stomach and balls, the feeling that meant the work he was doing, or, in this case, witnessing, was about to erupt from mere theory into reality. He held his breath. The significance of the maneuvers he was watching, now so far beyond the rudimentary state of his own magic skills, that he had no idea of the consequences it would have. The entire grove was shaking. Felixson could hear noises like distant fireworks, boom upon boom upon boom. There was fire striking fire in every direction. Felixson glanced up at his master's face, face, and to his astonishment saw there an expression he'd never seen before. A smile. "Cover your face," the Hell Priest said. Felixson did as he was instructed, and covered his face with his hands. But curiosity had the better of him. He peered between his fingers and watched as the spectacle continued to escalate. The smile had not left his master's face. Indeed, it grew clearer, Felixson saw, as the Hell Priest lifted his arms into a pose of the triumphantly crucified. The response from the energies was instantaneous. They wrapped themselves around his arms and fingers. Something was imminent, Felixson knew, and he couldn't bring himself to look away. Harry looked back at Lana. How close are we to your place?" Another mile or so. What the fuck is going on?" "Good," said Harry. He opened the door and got out of the car. "Everyone wait here. This can't be a coincidence." Shouldn't we be..." Harry silenced Kaz's protest with a flick of the wrists. Looked left, then right. The street was empty. The only other vehicles beside Kaz's van had been abandoned and stripped of all but their paint. Not a single light was burning in any of the nearby houses. Despite the inhospitable atmosphere, none of Harry's tattoos were tingling. Either this was the real deal, or it was one hell of a mirage. Harry crossed the street and shouted at the diminutive man standing on his corner. "Hey, Dale! Are you lost or something?" Dale looked up at Harry as though he hadn't even noticed the presence of another soul. "Harry?" Dale asked as he stepped into the street, giving 5% of his attention to Harry and devoting the rest into taking his surroundings. "Hell of a thing seeing you here," Harry said. "I just go where your dreams tell you to, right, I remember. And your dreams told you to stand in this exact spot..." Oh god. Doing all these different voices. Louisiana. "To stand in this exact spot at this exact moment." That didn't sound right at all. To stand in this exact spot at this exact moment." "Did they tell you I'd be here?" Dale smiled. "No, but it's a nice surprise," he said, his voice full of honeyed sincerity. "Saul and Belmer didn't feel like coming?" "Saul never comes along. And Miss Belmer, well, she was found dead last night, with a giant clit stuffed in her mouth. And it wasn't the clit they cut off." "So much for friends in high places. Good riddance, I say. Don't see me crying, do you? So, want to take a ride?" "Oh, in the van? No, I'm afraid that's not in the cards." "The what?" Harry stopped short. Every drop of ink on his skin suddenly unleashed a war cry, the sound of 1,000 silent air raid sirens, all going off at once. It was like a kick in his belly. His breath went out of him, and he dropped to the ground, blind to everything but to the din of his ink. Dimly he heard Kaz yelling to him, Get up! Get up! Norma says we've got to get out of here!" Then somehow Kaz was kneeling beside him. "Fucking A! Your fucking ink is having a primal scream," he said. Then, as suddenly as the sound had risen, it fell. Harry opened his eyes, and his senses came back to him. He took everything in. Kaz and Dale were staring down at him. Norma was listening to the wind. "Everyone," Harry said weakly, "meet Dale." As in, Alan I. As in, oh god. Gambit, I gotta do Gambit. Mon chéri. No. As in Alan A, Dale said. Charmed. As everyone traded hellos, Harry took in a deep breath and slowly got to his feet. "He's a friend I met in New Orleans. He's good people, aren't you, Dale?" "Easy there," said Kaz. "I'm fine," said Lana. "Didn't look fine," said Lana. "I'm fine," said Harry. Harry said. "It just got very loud, very fast." "It must be getting close," Dale said. "I guess whatever it was big," Harry said. "We should go now, before it gets here." "Before what gets here?" Lana said. Dale turned and answered her question. "Hell." Damn, there's gonna be a breach point here," Norma said. Something in another pale wants access to this place, and I'll be damned." Norma stopped short. "I just realized there aren't any ghosts here." She half turned and directed her face to the sky. Then after a few seconds, "Not a one." What's that noise? Kaz said. It had suddenly begun all around them. Not one sound, but many. Harry turned to the spot, listening for its source. It's the houses, Harry said. Windows rattling against their frames, locked doors vibrating as though they were about to tear themselves open. Loose tiles on the roof were shaken free and slid down, smashing on the ground below, while from inside the houses came the noise of innumerable domestic objects dancing to the same summons. There was an escalating din of objects falling and smashing, crockery, bottles, lamps, mirrors, as though each house was being vandalized at the same time. Looks like we're in for a fight, Kaz said. God damn it, said Lana. Wrong place, wrong time. Story of my fucking life. Harry reached beneath the driver's seat of his van and pulled out a piece of rolled carpeting. He laid it on the sidewalk and, crouching down, unrolled it, calling to his friends as he did so. Anyone want in on this? Harry glanced at the selection of knives and other lethal tools that were laid out on the 2-foot-long piece of threadbare carpet. The longest was a much-scratched machete, which Harry had need of once before, and there was a selection of 6 other blades. The longest, a substantial hunting knife. The smallest, a knife Kaz had been given on Valentine's Day by a butcher he'd once dated. No thanks. Too many bad memories. But give Norma a knife. Kaz nodded, and made a selection for Norma. Dale picked up the machete. Still, the loose energies on the street took their fill on the houses, blowing some of the windows in and some out, as though there was something almost tidal about the rising powers. At one point, the street lights went out, despite Harry's earlier protestations. Kaz put a knife in... Despite Harry's earlier... Oh gosh. All at once, the street lights went out, and, despite Harry's early protestations, Kaz put a knife in Harry's hand. Harry nodded in agreement. Your tattoos? Harry asked. Berserk, said Harry. Any ideas? None I like. 9. The entire wood was a bewildering complex motion, the air around the Hell Priest a cosmos of mote-freighted paths, so elaborately intertwined in places they formed knots through which the traffic light fragments continued to flow. Shockwaves spread from the spot in all directions, their force pressing the dust away from the epicenter, creating, in the process, an expanding sphere of steadily more concentrated matter. Get inside, the Hell Priest said to Felixson, who had retreated into the softened thicket as a safe place from which to watch events unfold. He trusted his master, and immediately did as he was instructed, moving out of the thicket. Still crouched over, he bent through the wall of a flaming brush. I'm sure that's picking up.
Sorry.
That's okay. Oh god, I'm peeking so much. I'm just gonna turn the gain down. There we are. Still, crouched over, he stepped through a thicket of flaming brush. It was quick, and it wasn't pleasant. The air on his head and body was instantly seared off. The clothes he had made himself in a pitiable attempt at propriety burned to grey ash in a second, adding fire to cleanse his groin. He now looked like a child down there, he thought, his manhood reduced to a nub, his balls tight against his body. But he was safe inside the still expanding sphere and close to his master. Then the Hell Priest quickly scrawled something upon the air, leaving a few black characters in front of him. I am unlocking the restraints I put on your memory. Trains? Of course. Without them you would have gone mad long ago, but I have need of your assistance. There. A small part of what you knew has been restored. Use it sparingly, and in my service, and I will reward you with more by increments. A few narrow doors had suddenly opened in Felixson's head, each one a book, its contents a piece of his power. The knowledge brought with it a tiny piece of his history, and he was suddenly mortified at his state. A freakish, prostrate gibberer, his hairless groin and inadequate genitals humiliating. He would cover himself as soon as he had an opportunity, but for now he put the problem of his metaphorical and literal nakedness aside and returned his attentions to his master. The gift is most welcome, master, he said, finding the power to form a coherent sentence had also been restored. Whether it was on purpose or an unintended side effect of his master's working, Felixson knew not, but he knew enough not to question that. "Remember that," said the Hell Priest. "Of course, your generosity, not the gift, Felixson. Master, remember my name. Forget it and an instant. Forget it for an instant, and I'll wipe you clean. You won't even remember to crouch when you shit." "Yes, master." As he trembled, his mind filled with doors opening and closing, and howling winds that had sprung up from compass points he could not even name. And in those winds came words and phrases arbitrarily loosed from the remembered pages. The place where he had stepped into the blazing thicket had become brighter by orders of magnitude, so bright indeed that Felixson had to avert his eyes, and shielding his face with his right hand, he studied what he could now see at this oblique angle. The Hell Priest wasn't smiling now. Felixson was fairly certain of that. Indeed, there were signs suggesting that even the Hell Priest was taken aback by the scale of the eruption. "Watch," the Cenobite had said. "Every detail." And then, the remark from which Felixson had taken the greatest comfort, "The future will want to know." How much better might the Hell Priest be persuaded to treat him now that he wasn't simply a naked runt of a man, but had witnessed a part of his master's journey towards apotheosis. Nor was it just any part. It was the beginning he'd witnessed, the purging of the old, the piercing of his flesh, the striking of a spark that was going to blossom, if he judged correctly the priest's nature and ambition correctly, into conflagrations that would change the shape of history forever. Felixson's speculation ceased there. The Hell Priest was walking towards the ignited air, and Felixson followed step for step. The brightness divided around them, but not without leaving traces of energies that, as they advanced, broke against their faces. The effect upon Felixson was not unlike that of his first snort of very pure cocaine, the heart quickening, the skin suddenly hot, the senses more alert. The sudden rush of confidence was there too, and it made Felixson want to pick up the pace of their advance, eager to see what, or who, lay on the other side of the bright passage. Felixson saw a sliver of that other place now, specifically a dark street by night, with some figures retreating from the spot where he and his master were emerging. Felixson was disappointed. This wasn't the way he expected it to be. Not at all. They were almost at the end of their passage now. 2 more steps, and the Hell Priest was standing on the asphalt. Another 2, and Felixson had joined him. This was the place where Felixson had done his time, wearing the mask of a magic man. Earth and memories flooded him. It wasn't the sight of the street and the dark houses that pricked Felixson's memory most deeply, however. It was the smell of the city air and of the sidewalks. A feeling of intense loss overwhelmed him for a moment as he thought of his once charmed life, of love and magic and friends, all of it and all of them dead. If he hadn't quickly governed himself, tears would have blinded him, and this outward display of weakness on this of all occasions would have been the end of him. His punishment, he knew, would be severe in contrast to the already limitless acts of unspeakable butchery that could be found in his master's grimoire. It was difficult, after the blaze of the passageway and the onslaught of the familiar, unwanted recollections, to make much more than a rudimentary sense of the scene into which he and his master had stepped. Lightless street, lightless houses, lightless sky, and some figures, visible only because they were illuminated by the wash of brightness from the fire-framed door through which he and his master had emerged. A young woman caught her eye first, her loveliness a welcome respite from the innumerable forms of ugliness that existed in the place he had just left behind, but there was nothing welcoming on her face. Her face was fixed on the Cenobite, of course, and while she watched him, her lips moved, though he could not catch a word of what she was saying. "Damor!" the Hell Priest called, his voice, though never loud, easily heard. Felixson turned, startled by his master's word. They had come back to Earth for the detective. They had come back, Felixson assumed, to finish what they started in New Orleans. Felixson, naked as the day he was born, searched the musk for the man his master was summoning. There was a short man who wielded a machete and a bemused look. Next to him was a tall, broken-nosed fellow who seemed to be protecting a blind black woman. Like the younger woman, there was no hint of welcome in her expression. She had curses on her lips, no doubt of that. And then, from the darkness off to their left, much closer to the doorway than any of the others, walked a man with a face that showed the marks of a life lived hard. Felixson had only a moment to scan the man's scars, because the man's eyes demanded his attention, and they would not be denied. It seemed to look at both the Hell Priest and Felixson at the same time. "Nobody touched your goddamn box," Demore said. "You shouldn't be here." I no longer have need for the box and its games," the Hell Priest said. "I have begun my sublime labor." "What in the fuck are you talking about?" said Harry, tightening his grip on the knife Kaz had given him. "I have brought an end to my order, so as to begin an endeavor I have been planning for most of your life. A life, it would seem, that refuses to be snuffed out. You have survived that which no man ought. I have given great thought to the choice of eyes that should witness the birth of the new world. I have a need for a mind that will preserve the events that are to unfold from this moment on. I have chosen you, Harry Demore." "What? Me? What about Fuckstick over there?" He threw a ragged gesture toward Felixson. "Why not him?" "Because hell has made you its business, or you have made hell yours. Perhaps both. I would be excused nothing by a witness such as you. Indeed, I encourage you to seek out the tiniest sign of frailty in me, and, should you find any, magnify it in your final testament." "My final testament?" "You won't simply witness what is going to unfold in hell from this point outward. You will make a testament of it, wherein my acts and my philosophies will be recounted in full detail. They will be my gospels, and I will forbid you nothing in their chapters and verses, as long as it is observed in truth, however far from my ideal of myself I may fall. Your job is to witness, to see and remember, changed perhaps by the sights you will have seen, but you will be amply rewarded." Norma reached out to Demore, starting towards him, but Kaz caught hold of her arm and gently restrained her. He couldn't restrain her tongue, however. "I know how these deals end up," Norma said. "There's always a catch. There's always a trick." "I have made my intention clear," the Hell Priest said. "What is your decision, detective?" "Somehow the words, 'fuck you,' don't seem strong enough," Harry said. As if in response to the priest's anger, the flames around the fiery door suddenly lost the parity of their brightness, tainted by darker colors, as though something was being burned alive, its boiling blood darkening the blaze. Pieces of its fire, withered stuff, tumbled from the walls of the conflagration, sending up columns of black-gray smoke that eclipsed the flames. "What part of 'fuck you' don't you understand?" Lana said. The demon uttered an indecipherable order as he made a counterclockwise flick of the wrist. The action sent Lana flying across the street at speed. She crashed against a chain-link fence, knocked unconscious before her head even hit the ground. Though the demon's incantation went unheard, his message was clear. The demon possessed a power he wasn't supposed to have. "What is your answer now, detective?" By way of reply, Harry pulled out his gun and walked toward the Cenobite, firing as he did so. He didn't bother wasting bullets on the torso. Even minor demons could take a lot of lead and not be slowed by it. Instead, he aimed for the head. If he could, he'd take out the bastard fuck's eyes, Harry thought. He leveled the Colt, aiming as carefully as speed would allow, and fired. The bullet entered the Cenobite's cheek, an inch below the left eye, and the force of it jerked back his head. He didn't lift it again, and this offered Harry a clear shot at the creature's throat, which he took. It opened a hole in the middle of his throat, and air whistled out. From behind him, he heard Norma yelling, "Let go of me! Harry, help me!" Harry glanced back to see that Pinhead's accomplice had slipped past Kaz and grabbed hold of Norma's hair. He held a crescent-bladed knife, like a small scythe, pressed to the lower portion of her abdomen. By the crazed look in her eyes and the vicious way he pushed the point of the weapon into her, it was clear that he would be happy to eviscerate her if Harry or his companions made one false move. Harry held his lanky arms in the air and was pleading with the thing. "Take me," Kaz said. "Let her go." "I like them vulnerable," Felixson said, backing towards the Hell Gate. Out of the corner of his eye, Harry saw that Dale was making a slow move toward the magician, apparently unnoticed. Harry felt a momentary sense of release, and then the priest uttered an incantation. Harry felt a stinging in his sinuses and turned to see that the Cenobite was leaking a dark, ominous ooze that was so potent it was dissolving the asphalt upon which it fell. The black ooze was dark blood that ran from the wounds Harry had inflicted upon the demon. The blood followed the lines of the scars on the Cenobite's face, down, across, until the drops cascaded down his neck and forked off towards each arm. The blood danced and held Harry's gaze long enough for a long moment, long enough for the power accruing in his adversary's hands to reach critical mass. The priest flicked his hands towards Harry, and a few stinging flecks of the black venom broke loose and burned Harry's gun hand. An idea formed in Harry's mind, and before he had time to rethink it, he advanced toward Pinhead, taking off his jacket. As he did so, Pinhead unleashed another burst of murderous mud that Harry quickly dodged. Harry was determined not to give the bastard a third chance. "What are you doing, D'Amour?" Pinhead demanded. As if in answer, Pinhead wrapped his jacket around his hands, and then, with no time to formulate a clear plan, he used it to catch hold of the demon's arm. It was a move that proved effective before, so Harry thought it couldn't hurt to attempt it a second time. Pinhead let out a cry that had a measure of fury in it, but it was mostly repugnance and outrage. The wild thought flashed through Harry's mind like sweet lightning, and his notion proved true. The demon had for so long lived uncontaminated by the proximity and certainly the touch of humanity that a rush of revulsion passed through him and momentarily gave Harry the advantage. He used it. Before the demon could entirely regovern his will, Harry pressed the demon's arm towards the ground between them. The churning filth continued to erupt from the creature's fingers. The asphalt it struck, cracking and scattering fragments in all directions. Harry wrenched the creature around, but with such violence and suddenness that the flow of filth emanating from his arms was spat off into the dark street. It hit Kaz's van, the metal shrieking as it was torn open, the muck apparently throwing itself around inside the vehicle, causing more damage than seemed possible. 5 seconds later, the gas tank exploded in a fat blossom of yellow and orange fire. There, apparently, was something combustible in Pinhead's killing muck, because the flame instantly followed the trail of black filth back towards the demon. It came with incredible speed, faster than even the demon could summon the words to extinguish it, and crawled up the poisonous arms that Harry had been gripping. Harry had barely let go of the remnants of his jacket, which was all but eaten away when the fire consumed it, and with a burst of searing energy struck him so hard he was hurled to the ground. The demon was blown back, and the conjuration of poison and flammable filth seeping from his arms disappeared as though it had never existed. The demon rose to his feet once more, to concentrate his efforts on reclaiming the mystical killing force of his black blood. The trouble was that this magic wasn't part of his training as a Cenobite. It was something he learned from an obscure magical treatises, the Trecete Sangre Vinculum, and he'd been certain he'd mastered it, but there was instability in the summoned matter that the treatises had made no mention of. Once a taunting element had been introduced, D'Amour's filthy presence at the Cenobite's left, the fire on the right, the equations were catastrophically thrown off. Had he exited Hell using the conventional methods, he could have simply used the his hooked weapons of choice, but that option was no longer available to him, and in calmer circumstances, he would have quickly scanned the contaminating outside forces and dispatched them. But with the confusion of the moment, his defenses compromised, he had no option but to retreat. He took 3 quick steps toward the threshold, looking for Felixson as he did so. The priest noted that, to Felixson's credit, He had taken hold of the blind woman, who he judged to be the second likeliest source of trouble in the field of battle. Felixson's maneuver had the effect of driving the whole of Harry's entourage back. The two males, one a wan, brutish thing, the other a diminutive fey specimen, were on their knees, enthralled to an incantation of dubious efficacy. Both men were forcibly resisting. The taller of the two's body was twitching with the effort it took to pull himself up, but it was clear that he was seconds from breaking free of Felixson's magic manacles. Clearly, there was nothing to do but to leave Demore and his allies to the elements. However, given the strength he sensed in the attachment between Demore and the blind woman, the demon seized something that could still be recovered from this fail coup. "Felixson, bring the blind meat with you." "Don't you fucking dare!" Demore shouted. As ever, the magician was quick to obey his master's words, and ignoring Demore and his empty threat, pulled Norma toward the burning door, dick and balls flapping as he wrenched her closer to its fiery archway. She fought furiously, scratching and kicking at Felixson over and over, but none of her blows were powerful enough to make him release his grip. The scene was too much for Harry. The all-too-crisp night air, the scent of the infernal fire, the imminent loss of another partner at the hands of the malformed beast. The combination was too specific in his repetition to be believed and rendered Harry utterly The combination was too specific in his repetition to be believed, and it rendered Harry utterly immobile. When the magician turned, the last of his powers over Kaz and Dale went out. Kaz, freed from Felixson's hold, got to his feet and immediately went in pursuit of Norma. But Felixson had gained the door by now, and a few strides, he and his captive were through it and gone from sight, leaving only the demon on the threshold. Lana had finally regained consciousness and picked herself up from off the ground. Though her short waking exposure to Pinhead's toxic secretion had left her feeling nauseated and unsteady. The demon disregarded them entirely. He continued to step back through the gate and into the bright passage beyond. In that little time, the flames from which the door formed had already started to diminish. "Do something!" a man's voice said somewhere very far from Harry. "Jesus Christ! Harold! Fucking wake up!" Harry snapped to attention. It was Kaz who had been screaming at him. He looked about and found that his friends were bruised and battered, but heading directly towards him, toward the porthole through which one of the most notorious demons in hell had just fled with his best friend. Harry realized he had no time for measured decisions. He had to move, but quick. "Right behind you, asshole," he heard himself say. Hell had come for Harry Demore on this street, and, failing to catch him, had taken Norma Payne instead. Now Harry would go after her, even if he had to go alone. Without thinking, Harry leapt through the gate. Harry heard Kaz yell something behind him, but with the flames dying out and the passage through becoming harder and harder to see, Harry didn't dare risk looking back. Another 2, 3 strides, and he drew a breath that was denser, no, dirtier than the breath that had preceded it, and 2 strides later ran into what felt like fresh cloths hauled from a pail of hot water and shit, being pressed against his face and thrust down his throat as though trying to smother him. His momentum faltered, his heart hammering as he tried to keep panic from overcoming him. It was the greatest of terrors, smothering, and he was sorely tempted to retreat, a step, or 2, or 3, back into the crisp, merciful air of the world at his back. But his friends were at his back now. "Fuck me," said Lana in short, suffocated breaths. Harry looked at them in belief with his shit-teared eyes. "This is my fight. You have to go back," Harry said. My dream told me to be here," Dale said, "and here I will stay." We're not leaving you or Norma behind," Kaz said. "No way," said Lana. "You guys are sure about this?" Harry said. "Not at all," said Kaz. Harry nodded, and they pressed on. No more was said as they made their way through the miasma, never once looking back. Let's see, how long to the end of the next book? We still got a decent ways to go. I think I'm going to call it there. It's been about 3 hours. My throat's getting a little sore, so I'll give it a rest. If anyone's still out there, I want to thank you for coming and joining me on this dark and shadowy night. The Scarlet Gospels is really getting moving now, and within maybe another 2 sessions, we'll probably finish it up. Thank you. Broadcasting from the darkest corners of the night, this is Tom Mordred's Midnight Radio.